keep forgetting I have to click two things to go live. You think you hit one button and you go live, and then you're waiting and you're seeing nothing's happening. Well, this phone should be YouTube, should be notified. But nothing happens. Like, wait, what happened? It's not going live. What's wrong? All right, there it was. All right. So tonight we're going to have Alan Bishop on. We're going to have Clint. He's going to jump in here with us as too. What's going on, O'Sheen? So be a full house tonight. We're going to have Alan on, and Clint's going to jump in here with us, and he's going to try to field the questions. First we're going to introduce Alan. He's going to be on here in a minute. We're going to introduce Alan, let him kind of talk about what he's got going on lately. He's busy as hell, got a lot of oars in the water, and kind of let him, share some of his info with our viewers, and kind of letting everybody get to know Alan more that don't know Alan. If you don't already. But then we're going to, I've got some questions that a lot of users, I see a lot of people asking and getting repeated questions and stuff. And it'd be good to kind of go over a few of the questions that everybody asks. And then after that, we're going to try to field some questions. So, Florida and the Hizzle, good to have you. All right, that's going on, Rusty. All right, let me share these links. So, Clint should be here by now. I don't know where Clint's at, but I've got to get these links out and get this brought up so I can share the links. So bear with me just a while I just done. And we'll get down to business, brass tacks, as they say. So I'll try not to be dead air Dennis here, so we'll have to kind of chat as we go. Oh, I heard somebody popping in here. All right, there's Clint. What's going on, brother?
Oh, I'm here.
All
it took me a
right.
little bit.
I just want to make sure. It's like, man, Clint's slacking on us here. Now, can you see the comments better that way or that way?
That way's pretty good.
That
I
way.
just got to get, I got to get them up on a big screen.
Is it better wide or tall? I'm thinking we're going to have to go tall so we can make room
tall
for Alan
is better.
down here. Yeah, I think we're going to have to do that so we can make room for Alan down here between us in the middle. So Alan will be with us in just a second. You're going to talk to everybody and entertain them while I share these links. So show them how you juggle.
Hey, Joe, have you got your headphones on?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, because I hear an echo in the background. I don't have the TV or anything else on.
Oh, hell. Do you have Facebook and StreamYard open?
Right now, I've only got the StreamYard open. I was trying to get YouTube to cast up to my TV, and I was having a problem with it.
You're probably getting feedback through both of those, maybe.
Yeah, give me a minute. I'm gonna try to get Facebook.
Yeah, you just have to you'll have to turn the audio down on one or the other. That's the only way you can do it.
I don't have any audio on right now.
All right, let me get Alan in here and we'll see. And Alan will be talking about what he's got going on, and I get these links shared so y'all can. What's going on, Alan?
What's up, guys? How you doing, man?
Doing good, brother.
You too.
Good to see you, man. I don't know if
I'm doing good.
Get my right hand man Clint or not, but Clint used to work at a distillery for about 20 years or so, and
oh wow,
he helps me out a lot in the group and in the chat, and helps answer questions and stuff. So I decided let him. He helps a lot. He does. He
yeah.
So we're gonna let him jump in here with us tonight and get a little FaceTime in, and
excellent.
Join in the conversation. So I do got to share these links. So while I'm doing that, fill everybody in about Old Homestead, your old French Lick, your Almanac, the One Time Distillery, the Practical, Distillers and Alchemist Almanac, and what am I forgetting here?
The Alchemist all the things.
The Alchemist Cabinet. Yeah. There's more, I'm sure.
Yeah, there's a reason I'm always late to everything I get invited to, man. I apologize.
No, man, you're not late. We're just now getting on, and I got to get the links going and all that. So perfect time, actually. You did a little bit of
Awesome.
introduction, but I want you to tell
Hey,
everybody
Alan.
what's going on, all the viewers what's going on, and share your links and all that information, or just tell them where to find you on LinkedIn and
Will do.
Facebook, YouTube. What's the other ones?
There's a bunch. I'll get them all. Well,
right.
First and foremost, thanks for having me again. And Clint, very nice to meet you for sure.
It's certainly nice meeting you, Alan. I've been looking
absolutely.
forward to it. I've done a lot of reading up on you. I've watched several of your shows, and I admire you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah. To catch everybody else up, my name is Alan Bishop. I am the head alchemist, as I call myself, at Old Homestead Distillery. I don't call myself master distiller. That's a title that is very misused, and people don't really understand the history of where that came from and what it was and what it means now. So I use head alchemist because I feel like if you're going to be pompous, you might as well be all the way pompous and go all the way in. So, head alchemist kind of fits the bill. You're going to be pompous. But so my background, come from a family of moonshiners, home distillers, whatever you'd like to call them, here in southern Indiana, Washington County, Pekin, Indiana area. Grew up on a tobacco farm, raising tobacco and making moonshine. My parents and grandparents both worked at the local factories, and we made moonshine and raised tobacco basically to pay property taxes, pay for Christmas, pay for emergencies, and kind of grew up in it. And then by the time I was about 30 years old, after sort of piddling around here on the farm, playing around with a lot of plant breeding organic seeds, I finally decided to go try to get me a job in the industry. Ended up at Copper and Kings, was there for a couple years, laid out their absinthe program, helped with their apple brandy program. Ended up at Spirits of French Lick, head alchemist there for 8 years, laid out every product that they have, every story that they have, all the background that they have, all that stuff, and finally got the opportunity few years back consulting for Stephen Bartell, Steve Shirk, and Heather Seitzer with my business partner, Jolie Kasperzak. We got a little ownership in this new distillery we call Old Homestead, which is located near Patoka Lake, right next to Patoka Lake, actually. It's part of a larger overall scheme, which is we've got the marina, we've got the gas station, we've got the winery, we've got floating cabins, land cabins, we got a 28-room hotel, we got the distillery. There's a brewery next to it. We don't own it, but we own the building. So we call that whole thing Alcohol Acres. It'll be set up not only, it'll be set up not only as obviously a production distillery with a tasting room plus distribution, but in time we'll also be doing, distilling classes and things of that nature there. Probably bringing in guests. We talked to Jesse from Still It. I think we're going to try to get him in there.
Awesome.
Maybe as early as this year. So now that things are starting to move, it takes a distillery to really get a distillery going that's of decent size and economic consequence. It really takes you a couple years to sort of iron out all the things, you know what I mean? Especially if you're in a state like we are, where we can't just go and buy someone else's alcohol and put it in our tasting room. Anything that hits that tasting room has to be 60% ours from start to finish. We can bring in stuff, but it has to be blended. So, it's long road to hoe. We're getting there. We've got our protocols under control, etc. But the other things I do, so I do the One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute, which is all about answering questions about the art of distillation, whether it be home distilling or professional distilling or moonshining. I do a lot of historical reenactment with distilling. I've done that for years and years and years. I've been out to George Washington's Mount Vernon many times. Actually laid out the American whiskey protocol for those guys and laid out a recent apple brandy protocol the last couple of years with my buddies Eric Wolf from Stolen Wolf and Aiden Pemberton. And JJ Jackson was there for some of that stuff too, which is cool. And Amanda, absolutely. And Amanda is a very, very close friend of mine and somebody who I really like in the industry. And I think she's got big things in front of her. I just wish she was in a different state other than Virginia. That's a pain in the ass state to deal with.
Tough. It's a tough state. Yeah, it is.
Hey, Alan.
Yeah.
I appreciate meeting you. I really enjoyed it. I'm going to jump back into the comments for now.
Okay.
And but Joe, he's got some questions that I forwarded to him. Which
excellent.
All right. Well, anyway, it's nice meeting you.
You too, man. You too. And please reach out on social media. I'd love to talk to you some more. Okay,
I'd love to.
So, yeah, absolutely. So have a good one. I'll throw in too. I have done Distillers Talk podcast for years with Christy Atkinson. It's on hiatus right now. Sacred and Profane podcast, which is basically all about ranting about the industry at the moment with my still hand Tyler Richardson. And if you have Ghost Podcast, all about the paranormal, 14, all that weird stuff. And then as you mentioned, probably my favorite project of all, the thing I'm more passionate about than anything else I do is the Practical Distillers and Alchemist Almanac. It's like a farmer's almanac, but it's also like what they used to call the old Bibliothèque Blue books. Oh, I drop out there. It's also like the old Bibliothèque Blue books that they used to sell in France way back in the day. So there's some light magic, grimoire, folk stuff in there as well. So yeah, that's kind of the picture, I guess, overall. So I do things.
Yeah, you stay pretty busy, which is why we're lucky to get you on here, man. I know how busy your schedule is, and we really appreciate you taking the time to jump on here with us and kind of help us out and let everybody, at the same time, plug yourself and get the word out to those that haven't met you. I don't know what rock they've been living under, but gotta get my brother out there, and all the information that you got going on. He's busy man.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, Clint threw me on the bus there with his question. I didn't have time to get all those. Let me pull up his list of questions, and I've got some too that a lot of the group members have been asking and stuff. And I'll start out with kind of one of the more basic questions, and I've kind of answered it in my terms, and I'd like for you to kind of explain it maybe a little bit more in depth, in your terms, based on your experience. And that's, how far do you let a mash settle out before you run it? Do you wait for it to get perfectly clear? No. Do you run it while there's still particulates in suspension? Probably not. Do you how exactly kind of milky still? Because my thoughts are milky still, but I want to hear your thoughts on it and your brainstorming on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And as always with a question like that, and that's why I love doing like the one piece at a time Distilling Institute on YouTube, is because of questions like that.
Right.
Because there's so many variables with that, right? So it kind of depends. For me, it would depend on the equipment and of course what I'm doing. Obviously at work, I've got Bain Marie stills, I've got agitation. So I'm going grain in, everything, yeast,
Right.
Everything's going in that still.
So you're distilling on the grain.
Yeah.
So
now, and
it's not an issue then.
Right. But now at home, obviously that's an issue, but on a historic style still, it kind of depends on a couple things. So what's the shape? If it's a turnip shape and you can keep the top off of it and keep it stirred up till it gets boiling, man, I'll run 2 pounds of grain per gallon in that thing and not have a problem. If it's a traditional moonshine still, especially a taller, skinnier one, I don't mind to run it milky. If I'm running on propane, you just got to watch what you're doing, and don't crank your flame all the way up, and it's normal sometimes to scorch just a little bitty bit. That's part of it from time to time. That's going to happen. But I think for most home distillers, I think a little bit of that milky character in there, that's not going to hurt anything. Now, don't go disturbing the yeast bed. Don't.
Right. That's what I was going to ask you. When you do that, do you sparge the yeast bed and the flocculants off, and to just throw the grain in, or do you just dump it all in there?
When I was growing up, and up until probably 10 years ago.
I mean, on your jacketed stills, not
on the jacket. Yeah. We mix everything up. Yeah. So I love some of the heavier flavors, especially for barrel matured distillate that you get specifically from the yeast bed itself, from the lees. And that's an old brandy trick. And even sometimes, now I don't get to do it with the whiskeys we make because it all is going in at one time. But say if I'm going to run a brandy, sometimes I will set the tank bottoms aside with all that lees in it and run that on its own and mark it as its own thing, because it becomes so big and rich and bold and it's almost chewy, and you can take a barrel of that and set that aside somewhere, come back to it and add a little bit of that to your brandy when you go to blend it years down the road, and it makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah, a lot more phenolics, in there than it, just a standard, settled out mash with all that extra vegetable matter in there. You're getting a lot more flavors, especially being able to distill on the grain. That's awesome. But for most of us small time guys on a regular pot still. Now I noticed too, like in a submarine, that's something else, that gets that, that turning over and motion. I know Wayne, likes his little stainless steel sub pots, and those are awesome for that. And I know he's using the air agitation in the bottom to help keep things moving, so you can distill on the grain. I think that's awesome. I've been trying to get him to use a magnetic drive, where
That's a
from the
good idea.
outside you can kind of spin a wheel, just that way you don't have any protrusions going through the steel, but you've got that magnet on each side turning wheels to help agitate. Now I just like seeing shit move. I'm kind of a steampunk
I do too.
guy.
I do too.
I love steampunk stuff, so I think that would be the fucking bomb to see that in action and stuff. And I've been telling Wayne, I saw that one video where you're kind of struggling to hold the big copper funnel filling that barrel, and I'm like, Wayne, making a stand to fit right over a barrel that he can put that funnel in so it won't move. And I don't know if he's done it or not. We may have to work one out and copy.
He's gonna murder me one of these days, man, because I got a lot of friends that do copper work, including some old guys from Vendome. And the guys from Vendome, my buddy Sean Stevens, years ago, he made my first Dona jug and all that stuff. But Sean's got a little bit of a bad back, and I'd call him every once in a while or text him every once in a while and run an idea by him like I do Wayne, right? And Sean finally got to the point where he would text me back and he would just say wrong number. But another little thing though, I'll add this in here for people because I think it's important too. If I was running a still that was electric and it was element in the pot, I'd be much more apt to let everything clear. I'd probably work out of carboys as much as anything and do a lot of racking off.
Right. Yeah, we've talked about primary, secondary, and sometimes even a third racking, especially in the brandies and stuff, and in the wine making and all that. And yeah, I kind of push, because most of us can't, distill on the grain, and if they do, I'm gonna start though. I've got the little Vever's got the false bottom, so I'm gonna sparge, some corn and get all the small stuff out, and sparge all that out, but just put the grain in and in a bag and put in there and kind of experiment with that a little bit because that's perfect. It keeps it off.
Them Vevers,
scorch. They're awesome. Skills, man.
They're fantastic for that. You put a little bit of money into them and get you some reducers because they're the weird size, like whatever it is, like 2.5.
Yeah.
Get you some reducers, throw you some sight glasses on there, get you a good head, and that false bottom. I love that thing. The only warning I'll give people about using that false bottom, I use brew bag in them all the time, and it's no problem. But sorry, my dog ran in. The big thing is make sure you put something underneath that false bottom. I'll take a couple jars, 3 or 4 jars, and put under there. So that false bottom, if you get up to boil, it doesn't.
Yeah, it's kind of thin and flimsy.
Yep. But it works great. It works great. I love it for. I mean, if I was still at home on a small scale, distilling on a small scale all the time, honestly, I'd probably. What's the biggest size? Those they got a 14 or 15 gallon?
18 and a half. 18 and a
half.
I think.
Gallon, 18 and a half. Yeah, I'd get me a couple of them, man. That'd be my stripping still on everything.
You, man, it's so awesome, and I push the hell out of them. The football stills. Now the 3 pots, not so much because they got the bad gaskets and the undersized tubing and the thumper and the I guess the peat pot sitting right there in the middle and right on top of the steel itself, and it's just that's not where it's at.
Well, I'll tell you what I had. I'll have to see if I can find a picture before I stopped distilling at home because I was working on getting into, having some ownership of this distillery.
One. That's back when we brainstormed, talked about inline infusions, and so you picked one up, and I remember seeing you working on it. And I was like, man, and you started promoting them too. And I was like, man, a lot of people knock them because they're made in China, and what they don't realize is all the stainless parts and stuff we use are also made in China. So
my stills at work come right off the boat, man. That's where they come from.
They're a little thin and flimsy, but for what you got into them, you can't beat it.
You can't beat it.
Yeah.
And what I had before I got out of it at home, I'll see if I can find you a picture to send to you. Because I work with Wayne on a lot of stuff, and I've got a sub. Me and Wayne designed the sub and came up with that. I've had all kinds of craziness. Most of it I've got at the distillery now, but I was using the Weaver, the pot off the Weaver. I'd gotten all the reducers. I'd put good, it's got all the valves on it. I bought me some good stainless valves and put on there. I ran that thing to a 2-inch riser, took it up to that Mr. Fusion head in case I wanted to reflux a little bit, packed the riser. And then on top of the Mr. Fusion, it went to a sight glass, and it had to be this tall for this reason, because then it went over and it went to one of the 4-barrel condensers off one of Rick Gibson's old Tennessee Thumper systems, the first one they ever built for me with a bypass. So I had a Cold Springs Copperworks Parrot with it. So I had almost short of 13 stills. I had, a lineup on this one still of pieces and parts. And
yeah, I remember seeing some pictures of it back in the day. That's the old days. Yeah.
Right. Yep. But
I
go ahead. Oh, you could go ahead.
Yeah, I remember I was gonna say, I remember when Rick came up with the infusion. Him and Phil Billy came up with it. I guess both of them about the same time came up with the infusions on the little Thumper and putting the fruit ports in and all that, and kind of, about the same time, I came out with that bypass, and then I think I posted a picture, and then you and Wayne were like, "Damn it, we're getting ready to put the inline infuser," and those were good times, man. Good days,
yep.
For sure.
Absolutely, a lot of good equipment came out of. A lot of good equipment came out between, Rick Gibson and Cold Spring Copperworks, and guys like Wayne coming in.
Yep.
People who were willing to listen to ideas. And the thing is, me and Wayne talked about this a million times. None of it was new. All of that stuff, if you went back 1500s.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say, you look back at the 1800s, man, and most stills look like a distill. I mean, like a gasoline refinery. It was way overthought, way too complex, and things have actually devolved from that point to more simple and better methods. We found, but they definitely over invented the wheel back in the day, man. There was a lot of different setups, a lot of unique stuff that they've tried, and some of it worked out well, and some of it not so well.
Right, right.
I love looking at all that old stuff, man.
There's so many of those things, as I tell Wayne all the time too, and I've talked to and Amanda as well. I've had several conversations like this with her. There's a lot of those things that, sometimes things get lost in history because they need to go away. But there's a bunch of those things that got lost in history because Prohibition hit, or the ban on absinthe. There were absinthe specific things that got dropped because the ban on absinthe, and it's not because they didn't work. It's just because Prohibition, if you think about it on the legal side of things, you had a whole generation of distillers that died out or retired during that time period, and when the new guys came in, there was nobody to say, hey, we used to have this thing that we could probably get the copper guy to make, and it just faded out into nothingness. And so
where did slobber box come from? We always called it peep slobber box.
I think it is. I think Tyler and I talk about this a little bit at work sometimes. There's things like that, right? Which are like hillbilly ingenuity in the best way. But there's a lot of things that I think existed or were created in many ways. Because when Prohibition hit, or when other, local prohibitions hit different places before even national prohibition, there's a lot of money to be made off of whiskey. And I'm sure the slobber box goes back farther than this, but just as an example, anytime where there's a lot of money to be made off something, a whole bunch of people that ain't never done it before get involved. They don't necessarily know what they're doing. And so you gotta, damn, I need brakes on this thing. How do you do that?
So it kind of arrived out of necessity. I do know that during the Depression, and the Prohibition, a lot of distillers were out of work, and, instead of finding jobs in the steel mills and in building and stuff, they just said, fuck it. I'm going to take my talents, and we're going to hook up with some of these moonshiners, and we're going to make some liquor together. And I think that really helped promote a lot of the science to a lot of moonshiners and backwoods shiners. And I think they evolved pretty quickly as a result of that, and developed some good habits, and definitely improved their craft. And they kind of shared a little bit of each, because it was kind of crude to a lot of the distillers, going back and, going from the refinery to a simple submarine pot or a simple pot still. And it's like, whoa, wait, I mean, I'm used to all this, sophisticated stuff, man. You're going to have to help me out here. What's going on? And it's, kind of reteaching the basics to them. And at the same time, I think they, helped educate a lot of the backwoods distillers, and I think it
They
was a
did.
marriage made
And
in
I've
heaven actually for moonshine and for the
I've
distilling as well.
tried to trace some of that stuff over the years too, doing some of the history stuff that I do. And I'll give you two examples that are real similar to that. One, not so much on the backwoods side, although it is because it deals with frontier whiskey, but you think about something like the old log still, which of course you saw Tim Smith try to do on moonshiners, and he completely didn't understand that concept. But if you look at those old log stills and the way they evolved, and there's two different kinds. There's a kind he was trying to build, and then there's a round log still that was made out of a hollowed out beech tree. And that's something like what the old Daisy Spring Mill distillery here in Indiana used to have. But they had a rectifying head with J tubes in it. That's exactly what a three chamber is. They just keep adding them on top of them. So three chamber evolved out of that. And then probably the best example of the backwoods guys I ever saw, and I've got to find the name of this book. I've mentioned it many times on podcasts. I never can remember it, but there was a book that was written in Philadelphia in the early 1800s. And it's not one that I've ever seen a reprint of, but I've got a PDF of it somewhere that somebody sent me. And it was a method for more efficient manufacturing of whiskey, basically. And everything that's in that book that was written at that time corresponds to the moonshine tradition that you later see develop at Land Between the Lakes, all the way to from coffin stills to double wall condensers to multiple thumpers, and then even making double thick mashes and dividing them, all came out of Pennsylvania and ended up there in Land Between the Lakes. So somebody from that Pennsylvania distillery had moved into Kentucky and brought that with them, and that's where that tradition came from. Much older tradition. So that is back now because Casey Jones and because Spencer Ballantyne brought it back into the legal industry. But it went from legal to the woods, stayed in the woods for damn near 2 centuries before it came back into a legal distillery. Through the filter of Golden Pond and all that stuff. So. But yeah, I love that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I love the history of it too, and that's where your knowledge comes in. I'm totally devoid of a lot of the history of it, and I've been reading up on it and learning, and a lot, as I was talking to Clint earlier, so much about the history of it, and not just the history, but all the different liquors and varieties that they make in some of these third world countries and other cultures, and the methods that they use. And stuff. It's so interesting to me. It's something I've never really researched much. I've always been fixated on the science and never really delved much into, a lot of the old world techniques and a lot of the old world, distillates and, in their methods of making them. It's kind of, that's where I'm kind of leaning towards now. That's why I gravitate today towards you so much, is because you're so into that as well, and doing the reenactments, man. I just love that shit. We all dress up in the period and do all that, man. I really dig that stuff. You need to do more of it, man. You and Eric and all of them. That's I loved it. The absinthe thing you all did was fantastic, man. It's awesome.
Yeah, that's the important stuff, and I think I've always probably been that way a little bit. Like I need to ask my parents sometime. I'm betting, and my dad will be brutally honest because that's the way he is. But I suspect that I was like that little shitty kid who was like, I've always been interested in cultures, but like, I remember how it started, or how I sort of viewed things as a kid. I think is like, you'd see somebody, like, let's say there was somebody else who knew that made moonshine or raised tobacco. That's just an easy example. It could have been anything, but you'd see them do something that we didn't do. And it wasn't enough for me to be like, well, I'd ask, well, how come we don't do it that way? Like, I would never settle for the answer of, well, because it's not the right way to do it, or because we just don't. Like, I had to be the annoying little shit that was like, why don't we do it that way? Right.
And why is it done that way? Why? And I used to take shit apart just to see what made it work. And that, that curiosity, is what drives us,
Yeah.
And I noticed talking earlier about your copper Donna, another question we get asked a lot, and I know that you're big into, is yeast propagation. So let's maybe, finish up with you want to talk about as far as the history and stuff and reenactments, and then we can kind of ease into the yeast propagation, because I know that's something you know a little bit about. And I've seen some of your videos, and really, really enjoyed watching those. And I think Gary kind of picked up on a lot of that as well and started doing his experiments, and I enjoy listening to him as well. He's a great guy. But so let's talk about yeast propagation and copper donnas and yeast brinks and all that good stuff, and how to keep it alive. We get a lot of people talking about, the best way to keep it alive. Do you need to dry it out, dehydrate it, or is it okay in a jar and water? And how much of the alcohol do you need to get out? Do you run through distilled water and kind of cleanse it before you do all this? And all these, because I teach that to do that, but I want to make sure I'm teaching them right too. Because it's
when it comes to that, there's so many misconceptions, and a part of that comes from prohibition. Really, what survived prohibition was sort of two strains of knowledge when it comes to whiskey anyways. Now beer is a little different, obviously, but you had either the Seagram's methods or the Beam methods. And when I say Beam, I don't mean like just straight up Jim Beam. I mean like the Beam family, because they work for everybody. Right. The Pennsylvania stuff died out. The Indiana stuff mostly died out, short of MGP, which is basically Seagram's anyways at that time. And it was a very, very hardcore scientific method. And so people still get kind of hung up on that, and they still get kind of hung up on the beer methods. And there's nothing wrong with those methods. But I guess first and foremost, I'm a huge proponent of home distillers and legal distillers both having their own yeast strains. Now, that doesn't mean don't ever buy any yeast. It doesn't mean don't experiment with purchased yeast. It doesn't mean any of that stuff. But that title, Master Distiller, we kind of were talking about when I first came on, that originally was not a thing. Your title in the 1800s was distiller and yeast keeper, yeast tender, basically. And your main job was, part of your quality control was maintaining your yeast. Because let's say you're in the early 1800s, it's very hard to get a good yeast strain that, initially when you're in a new place that has a good high alcohol tolerance, has good flavor to it. And they're specific to geographic locations. That's why sourdough isn't exactly, the same when you take it somewhere else where it's not from. That's why when you buy yeast from Italy that's used for baking and you bring it to the United States, it's not exactly the same. The ingredients are different, etc. So it was on you to maintain that yeast strain. And this is one of those things that I talk about with history all the time. We get really, really, really tied up on the science side of things sometimes, or we get really, really tied up on the backwoods side of things. And there is a happy medium between the two of them. And what I mean by this is a trained chemist or biologist is not necessarily going to make a great whiskey or maintain a great yeast strain. And a backwoods guy that's all backwoods and I only do it the way my grandpa did is never going to understand exactly the mechanism for how he can improve things, because mostly he's paralyzed by conjecture. He doesn't want to move forward from that thing that he knows. That's all he knows.
Yeah, that's
but there's
you get that a lot, especially in the older guys. They're set in their ways. They, there might be other ways to do it, but this is my way, and that's the way I'm going to continue to do it. And they,
I get it. I get it off both sides. Being in the industry, I get and Pat Heiss is a very good friend of mine from Wilderness Trail and Firm Solutions, and he disagrees with me 1,000,000% on yeast, and that's okay.
I love
the backwoods guys, they disagree with me 1,000,000% on yeast, and then you have don't use bread yeast guys. Well, bread yeast is an alcohol tolerant yeast, especially Fleischmann's.
It's a fine yeast. I've used it for ages. Let me say this real quick before we go on. To all the guys watching and asking questions, we're going to chat here for a little bit on a few topics, and then we will get to your questions. So bear with us, be patient, and we'll get to you. If it's a simple question, Clint's going to handle it. But some of the more complex questions, we're going to try to field if we don't cover it already. So hang in there with us. Don't get mad. We're not, directing you individually right now. We're going to go ahead and talk about these topics, and then we'll get to you guys. So, all right.
Yeah. So I learned everything sort of, from that backwoods direction and coming forward. So I knew how things worked long before I ever knew why they worked. And then as I got more and more curious, I try to dig into why things worked, like we talked about a while ago. And so the one problem that the scientific side has with things is they sort of look at people from 200, 300, even 400 years ago, going back, and they just sort of think that somehow they think that those people were way dumber than what we are, and it's not true at all. They were incredibly intelligent people.
And that's what gets me about people saying about moonshiners. You know, they talk about old moonshiners like, oh, you're just no moonshiner. I wouldn't expect you to know this. Oh, there's nothing that pisses us off for us. You know, we understand it, but we just don't understand the hows and whys, and
exactly,
maybe not the science of it. That's why I always kind of geared towards the science, so I can feel that void, you know, and kind of understand.
Well, and that's why I went the direction I did, because being in the legal industry, so especially coming to the Indiana side of the river here in southern Indiana, you know, and I was making bourbon at Spirits of French Lick, and I'm right across the river from Kentucky, but I'm on the wrong side of the Magic River, right? So
you're in northwestern Kentucky extended, right?
Right. So
we're
I kind of knew
the Virginia colony, maybe.
Yes. Yeah. I kind of knew that I had to get my shit together if I was going to be taken seriously by the legal side of the industry. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
You can't just be the dude that just does the moonshine thing and talks like that all the time to all these people, because some of these people, for better or worse, they're never going to take that seriously. And certainly within the bourbon circles, they wouldn't have. And listen, I have my passions like anybody else does, but I also have to pay my bills, so I had to play the game a little bit. So
yeah, you got to talk.
Yeah, I kept reading all these books, and I always did the thing. I never look at history from now going backwards. I go back as far as I can, and I come forward because I want to really understand what was happening and how things evolved. And so I kept coming across all these instances of people propagating their own yeast in the late 1700s, early 1800s. How important it was, how they'd keep 2 Dona jugs. Dona is a Greek word that means mother, essentially, like mother of vinegar. They'd keep 1 jug that they carried with them to and from work every day as a distiller, just like a lunchbox, and they took care of it, kept in their spring house at night, and then they'd take another one, seal it up, put it on a chain, drop it in an old well somewhere. It has no oxygen going to it. You know, the water's cold, makes the yeast go dormant. Man, yeast dies, they got that sample. If the distillery burns down, they got that sample. Their whiskey's not changing all that much. And I got thinking, okay, so there's all that, and then let's get into the science of it. So I started looking into the science of how yeast is propagated, looking at water slides, looking at auger plates, looking at cell counts. And I'm at Spirits of French Lick at this time, and I was lucky enough to be able to, well, I didn't ask, I just did it. I did it, and then I asked like 6 months later. It's like, oh, by the way, can I start propagating my own yeast?
Because I knew. Ask for forgiveness and permission. Yeah.
Yeah, just run with it.
Yeah.
So for a period of several years, maybe 5 or 6 years, we co-inoculated at Spirits of French Lick. And what that means is that we would make 500 gallons, which was a half of a fermenter every day. So we'd make a half fermenter day 1, use 1 yeast on that. Day 2, we'd use another yeast. Yeast number 1 was typically Fleischmann's that we started propagating ourselves. Right. And yeast number 2 was usually something like Vin 13 or OK. But then I was also doing standalone fermentations, where I was starting to actually capture yeast from different places, from different old distilleries here in southern Indiana, different places where there used to be distilleries in southern Indiana.
I kind of told the group, I think it's last Wednesday or Saturday, about, how you used to go to different distilleries and stuff and swab different things and pick up the yeast. Definitely want to hear about all that. That's cool.
Yep. And I still do that, man. That's part of what I consider, that's one of my primary motivators in life, is collecting weird yeast strains. And so the further I got into it, I learned how to dye yeast. I learned how to count yeast cells. I learned how to watch for mutations. And I say all this because before I tell you how I do everything, so that people understand that it doesn't have to be as scientific as it gets made out to be. For 5 years, I watched that Fleischmann strain at Spirits of French Lick, plus about 5 or 6 other strains I had wild captured from old distilleries. The only time I ever saw a notable mutation, ever saw a notable mutation, was when I'd either accidentally not been sterile enough and mixed 2 of them together, which is not really a mutation, you just created a new variety, or on the rare occasion that my conditions weren't the same. And what I mean by that is I had some massive temperature fluctuation. I had some massive pH fluctuation. Something was wrong. So long as those things didn't change, you might see minor little mutations here and there, but I never saw a single one that changed the quality, the aroma, and the taste of the whiskey that we were making. And I got so confident in this, I started doing blind test of samples with anybody who would stop back there and talk to me. And never once did anybody pick out anything. Now, you may lose a little yield sometimes here and there, but that's also not necessarily a bad thing on a small batch system. And we were losing yield more because we weren't using any exogenous enzymes whatsoever. And so we were finishing fermentations at like 1.010, which is traditionally where they would have finished at in the 1800s anyways.
Right.
And it leaves some aromatics behind and some interesting flavor precursors that come across during distillation.
Yeah, I want to we'll talk about that a little bit later, is how far to take it down. And also, stressing yeast to get certain congeners and esters.
Yes.
And stuff. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but go ahead.
And also when we get to that, remind me, stressing yeast to save money for your distillery, because I got an important thing I can add there.
Yeah, it'd be interesting.
Yeah, so basically, you can make this as easy as you want to make it as far as propagation goes. My general method is that I will determine like where I want to find a yeast at. All right, and then you can think about where the obvious places are. So if you find an old distillery, is there an old wood frame building there? If there's an old wood frame building, or maybe even a fermentation barrel like there was at the Daisy Spring Mill Distillery, it can literally be as simple as going in, having sterile swabs, have a sterile mason jar, sterilize some mash. So in other words, cook a grain mash, or even just wheat and sugar, but have it sterile and ready to go. Go in there and swab that thing down real well. I've even done it with a Q-tip. Star sand a Q-tip and let it set for a minute, and then go at it. And then drop that Q-tip right down there into the jar. I then will take that jar home and I'll split it into 2 samples. So sample number 1 is going to set on my kitchen counter where, it's the ambient temperature. It's going to sit there with the lid cracked so I can get plenty of air. Sample number 2 is getting tightened down. Add this after fermentation gets going after 24 hours, right? If after the fermentation gets going after 24 hours, or if it doesn't take off, I just throw it out and don't worry about it and start a new one.
Wheat as a nutrient along with your sugar.
Yes, yeah, that's the cheapest and simplest way, is just some wheat flour and some sugar. Now, normally
I'll preach bran flakes, which
probably
not sanitary, but yeah.
That's okay. Normally, and when I make that starter, I should say this too. I don't take that to a real high specific gravity. That goes to about 1040, maybe 1050 at the highest, because you got to remember that if there is the original yeast strain there, it's probably not adapted to high gravity washes anymore, so it's going to take a minute. So basically, I'll take the other sample, I'll seal it up, I'll put it in the refrigerator, let it go dormant. I'll watch the one on the counter for 36 to 48 hours, make sure I've got good vigorous fermentation. Does it smell good? Does it taste good? If it smells good and tastes good, then I probably have something there I can propagate. And so I'll take out of the refrigerator, and then I'll start making step mashes. I'll go from the jar up to 3 gallons. I'll go from 3 gallons to 5 gallons. And then from 5 gallons, believe it or not, if you got good cell count and it's good and vigorous, 3 gallons is actually enough. We do it every day. 3 gallons is enough to kick off 500 gallons of mash. By far, it's more, if you got a good healthy population.
Right.
So some background on this. So alcohol tolerant yeast is incredibly vigorous in terms of its survivability.
Right.
Once an alcohol tolerant yeast is introduced into an environment, it will live there as long as it has a food source pretty much forever and become one of the primary decomposers in that environment. So in the case of having a wooden building or something of that nature, it used to be a distillery. What'll happen is that yeast is all over the inside of that building. You'll see this on the East Coast with old school cider producers. They don't pitch yeast, and you walk inside their cidery, and it's covered, looks like cobwebs, and it's yeast is what it is, just in the air.
It's like powder mold over everything.
Yeah. It'll go into that wood, even if you don't see it. It'll go into that wood, and it'll live in that dry wood. And what it'll do is it will wait until that wood starts to rot, starts to get wet, little wood sugar comes out, that yeast will come right back to life. As soon as there's something for it to eat, you go somewhere where there's not a building at, maybe you knew where there was an old moonshine site at or something. You look for your flowering, fruiting plants, blackberries, raspberries, apples. That's what they're going to colonize. You go to the store, even you pick you up an apple that hasn't been waxed, an organic apple, or you pick you up some grapes that are organic. you're going to see there's like a white film on those, or you see them in your yard too. That's all natural yeast. And most of those yeasts that grow on fruit are also fairly well alcohol tolerant, up to about a 1055 specific gravity or so. So it's all there. It's all out there in nature to grab a hold of. And the other part of the experiment I did, I may have told you this last time, Sam, I don't remember, but for a long time, I don't remember how long it was, but my experiment for a long time when I got bored with just basic distilling was I would go out somewhere, just either out in the woods or out to some other place, hiking. And I would take me a 5-gallon bucket, and I'd take corn, and I'd take sugar, I'd start a fire, I'd sterilize everything, or I would just use whatever I could find locally. If there was an apple tree, and I'd use the water from the creek, I'd use whatever was there that I could get a hold of, buy as little as what I possibly could, and not pitch yeast. And I would leave it on site and come back to it, different, never the same place twice, just to see what that yeast was doing, just to see what that water was doing, just to see the effect of these different geographical places and how that was working out. So in terms of adapting it, so one thing where people mess up is they get a yeast going, and then they'll go from, basically working their way up. Again, you don't want to go to real high gravity at first. You want to adapt it to higher gravity over time. So 1075 being on the high end, keep an eye on your pH. Yeast kind of likes that 5.5 range generally if it's grain. If it's going to be a brandy adapted yeast, it's going to be more like a 4.8 to maybe all the way down into the 3s for a starting pH. Where people mess up is they'll go from one grain bill to another grain bill, or they'll go from a grain bill to a brandy bill, and then the yeast doesn't kick. Different conditions, or then it does mutate, right? That's where you'll start to see those things at. As far as keeping it going, this is where it gets really interesting. So I played with all of it. I did the water slides, which is a pain. I did the augers, which is a pain. And I honestly, I'm like water. I will get so comfortable with myself, I will find the easiest possible way I can just to see, will this work or will it not work? And sometimes that does backfire. But that Fleischmann's I told you about, when I say we propagated that for 5 years, after maybe the first year, we literally were just dipping back. So we'd go to the cooker, we'd pour the yeast in, we'd let it mix in for 15, 20 minutes. I'd pull some mash back out of that cooker, pour it right back into the jug. It'd be ready to go the next morning. And for those 4 years after that, nothing changed.
Yeah, a lot of yeast snobs, man, they don't realize that Fleischmann's has been around for a long time. And I think it was originally a distiller's yeast that they started using for breads, that
it was
actually started out as a distilling yeast and kind of slipped into the bread industry because it worked so well and giving. Now, a lot of people don't know it, but when you add the yeast to the bread like that, what you're doing is creating a lot of oxygen bubbles in the bread, and it gives it, I guess, expansive growth and softness and all those little holes you see in a slice of bread.
Pushing that CO2.
It's from CO2. So Clint had a question. He uses one of the questions he wanted to ask. He uses a Vod's Kveik yeast for speed in the beginning. Kveik yeast.
Yeah.
And then Hornindal to accentuate the fruit flavors. So he does the combination yeast as well. Starts out one, and that's something I've not done much of. Really, the only time that I've ever used 2 different yeasts is if I was using maybe a wine yeast or a champagne or a wine yeast on some of my wines or brandies, and get a stuck fermentation, and then I'd use the EC 1118 to help unstick it. So, that was the 2 different yeasts, but that is a champagne yeast, so I'm still in the same family, but there was 2 different yeasts being used. Red Star, I usually used the Red Star, Premier Rouge, and Premier Blanc, and then if it ever got stuck, I'd use the EC 1118, which is great for that. It's great for unsticking stuff.
And I still keep a bag. I keep a bag of N13 at work for exactly that reason. Something gets stuck. Listen, it's okay. I'm going to nuke it from orbit with this N13, and we're going to make it roll one way or the other.
And what's this you're talking about?
Yeast, Vin13 yeast. It's a EC 1118 basically, but so EC 1118, Vin13, and there's another variety called OKAY. Right. The Vin13 and OK are available through Scott Labs. I don't know if I've never heard of anybody being able to get it that wasn't a customer of Scott Labs, but they're South African brandy yeasts is what they are. So they'll go to 18%. They'll finish fast. They have the killer factor. But the cool thing about Vin and OK is they don't throw high SO2 levels. And because, well, let me rephrase that. They don't throw high acetaldehyde. Here's some weird science for you. Acetaldehyde, not only being a heads component, will give you more heads because SO2 and H2S both bond to acetaldehyde. So they don't have that particular problem. But the Kveiks are a good example of exactly what I'm talking about. And here's something easy for you guys, and I'm sure you know this, Santa, but the Kveiks, and Hornindal is a Kveik as well. It's actually an isolated Kveik. So the Kveiks come from sort of that Norwegian, just that Norse territory in general, Swiss, or Norway, all those Nordic countries, right? But they were used specifically for fermenting beer in seine houses. And a seine house is where you would make your malts. There's one here in Indiana owned by Sugar Creek, the only one in the United States that I know of, where you're smoking your malt. They get to high temperatures, even in the wintertime. It might be 110, 115 degrees in there. And these guys, to this day, still over there, they all maintain these farmhouse yeasts. They're still Cerevisiae varieties, so they're still just like Fleischmann's or your Champagne, etc. But they've been adapted to super high temperature fermentation, which allows them to produce crazy fruity esters. And they save their yeast without doing the liquid. And I can talk about dried yeast in a minute too. They do what's called a magic yeast log, which is something that me and Wayne have both experimented with. Sometimes they get really ornate and they make a design out of a piece of wood of some type. I like to use fruit tree branches that are a couple inches around, shave all the bark off, drill holes in it, etc., sterilize it. And once the fermentation gets going, toss that thing in there, let it set overnight, come in, pull it out. That yeast has now colonized that wood. You literally take it, tie a string to it, hang it up somewhere dark and cool. It's there next time you need it. You go in, you take it down, throw it in, start your next fermentation. That's the simplest version. It's also the version that the most can go wrong with. But
I wonder how well the very porous, like a balsa or something real porous, might adapt well to that. And that's talking about the high temperatures and stuff, and esterification and producing the ethyl acetates and all that. That's something we want to talk about too in the stressing a little bit. The high temperatures and how that does bring forth these, ethyl acetates and esters and stuff. And that's, we'll get into that in a little bit, but go ahead. Yeah.
So those Kveiks too, other really cool thing with them is everybody, even within a town, every family has their own Kveik. And what's really, really neat about it is that they're usually not just one strain. So like your Hornindal and your Omegas, that all actually came, if I remember right, that all came out of one sample where there were like 9 or 10 yeasts just floating around in this one sample that they pulled, and then they isolated each individual one of those. One of the yeasts that we use, I went the exact opposite direction. I gathered as many Kveiks as I could and put them all back together, including some I got from brewers over in Norway in particular. Now, I don't know how many of those strains still exist in my Kveik, but I presume the strongest ones have survived, and they're still moving right along pretty easily. But the other piece of information I came across early on was for dried yeast again, because the Dona jug, which is really cool. It's a really cool, interesting device. But again, I'm like water, and a Dona jug can get to be a pain if you're trying to keep something going all the time. And you want to make backups anyways in case something goes wrong. So what I kept coming across was these old distillers basically saying, I can't remember what the word was that they used. I think Bram, B-R-A-M, that they were pulling some of the fermented grains off of their fermenter and basically taking those and spreading them out real thin on like a piece of wax paper or paraffin, something like that. And they put it up in the rafters of the distillery and let it dry. So I started experimenting with that. Wait 24 hours after fermentation, or after fermentation starts. That's when you have between 24 and 36 hours. That's when you have the highest yeast cell count. That's when the yeast is the healthiest, is 24 to 36 hours in. Pull that off, spread it real thin, put it in a dehydrator at 90 degrees. Usually it takes 2 or 3 days to dry all the way down. And then I just take it, crumble it up, put it in a bag or an old coffee can or whatever I've got, put it in the freezer, If I want to use it, I pull it out, throw it into a coffee grinder, 2 or 3 pulses, get it to a powder. I can either pitch that directly or I can make a 5-gallon starter off of that to get everything going again. And that's how we back up all of our samples at the distillery now. So
I know Patrick has quite the collection of yeast, doesn't he?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That guy.
He's like the seed bank of yeast, isn't he?
You remember that scene from Ghostbusters where they asked Egon what his hobbies were, and he says the thing about collecting slime spores and mold. That's Pat.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
for sure. So, yeast is. I'll tell anybody too that wants to ever get into legal distilling, man. It took a great many years of dorky distillers like myself talking about heirloom grains to get the industry interested in heirloom grains, and now everybody's into that. And I've been talking about yeast now for a number of years because if you want to differentiate yourself that much more, how cool is it to have a strain that you have? Nobody else has it.
Right.
You know, we use one of the strains we have at Old Homestead is actually from one of the towns that's now underneath the lake at Old Homestead. There's an area there where there were some known moonshiners that we captured yeast from, and it was alcohol tolerant on the first try up to 1075. I pushed it as hard as I could, and nobody else has it. You know, it's ours. It's our specific thing. You know, I think that those things are worthwhile for sure. You know, I'll do goofy things like I go out here to this oak tree in the front yard sometimes, and I'll just pull a piece of bark off of it and start yeast off of it. And I may or may not use it for distilling, but I'll use it to make ginger beer. I'll use it for, you know, fermented bananas or things like that I'm doing that I eat. And it's just another one of those tricks to have, you know, up your sleeve, basically.
So basically, when you do the propagation of yeast, you're just capturing the yeast, you're feeding it a little bit of sugar and nutrients, making little micro mashes to keep it alive and to help it, you know, multiply, oxygenate it well, keep that breeding going, and just keep stepping it up. So
keep ratcheting it up as you go.
Keep building it, building it. Now, one question I want to ask before we go on, and this is kind of a question that I had, and something I don't know if anybody's tried it or done much with it yet. Have you heard of anybody sour mashing with the, you know, we talk about the yellow label angel yeast and how it's got its own enzymes built into it. And Scott Industries, before we get into that, Scott Industries has been a major player in the distilling and brewing and everything for a century or more. They really were the ones that brought enzymes and pectinase to the forefront, you know, from back in the old days, and creating a lot of different pectinases and using with fruits and in the wine industry, they've really been very instrumental in bringing all that about, and they're a big player, a lot bigger than a lot of people realize. Man,
they're massive.
Player. Yeah, they're a major player, and you don't hear their name much. You know, you don't hear it thrown around much. No,
it's definitely the wine industry is where you'll hear.
Yeah.
That's really what they've kind of catered themselves to more than anything over the years. But
most brandy makers and winemakers know, but you know, most just moonshiners and distillers, you know, we don't hear their name mentioned much for as big a player as they are. That's huge. But they really they brought a lot of pectinase and different pectic enzymes that really help the wine industry and the brandy industry in a big way.
Right.
Sure.
Right.
All right. Go ahead.
Well, one thing I forgot, I should probably mention that I forgot. This is where Santa, sometimes I suck at interviews because I have a hard time sometimes switching gears and being linear. But
my mind's in all directions too. I understand.
I'm also that guy that thinks like I have to give you all the information at once. But something really I think is important that's also kind of a tradition to look into. So traditionally, yeast was propagated alongside various botanicals. Eventually, it became hops. Beer brewers, you know, obviously use a lot of hops. In the United States, on the East Coast, hops were mostly the tradition you use. So you'd use just a very small amount of hops when you were making your starter. So when you're capturing your yeast or whenever you're propagating your yeast, there's always a little bit of hops in there. And the reason is because they're antimicrobial. Now, that's cool, but it does add a little flavor dimension. And anyone who has ever had A beam white label from the 1970s knows that there's a little bit of a foxy character to the old Jim Beam whiskeys that they were making from the 70s back.
Yeah.
That foxy character is those hops. That's what you're getting. That's where that's coming from.
I never knew that.
Yep. And that was true of all the big distilleries because they all got their yeast strain after Prohibition from the Beam family. Even in Pennsylvania, some of the distillers there, Michter's, Charles Everett Beam was the distiller at Michter's for years, and so he was bringing in the Beam yeast into Michter's. So you have that in Pennsylvania too. Now here in Indiana, we did something a little different. This is a trick that I think you guys will find more useful, especially if you don't want that foxy character. So one of the reasons I've never had major problems, and one of the reasons, knock on wood, I've never lost a professional mash. Now I've lost some at home dicking around being lazy. Don't get me wrong, I have. But one thing that helps me is I propagate alongside the yeast another microorganism. Well, multiple microorganisms really, but the main one that I'm after is a lactobacillus strain, which you can get out of any good active culture yogurt. And the reason I do this is I came across this many years ago. Short little story here, but you come into southern Indiana in the early 1800s, and there was a bonanza for land here where the karst systems and the springs were. People wanted to put in mills, put in distilleries. All these guys up in New York saw it, and they started coming down here buying up land to build mills and distilleries and flip them. And so one of the gentlemen who saw this going on was a guy named Joel Calkins, who was a land speculator up in New York, but he didn't have a lot of money. He hadn't done real well for himself. And he saw that a bunch of these distilleries were opening here in southern Indiana in the early 1800s, about 1820 or so, maybe 1825 as late as then. But he decides, I'll sell my land in New York. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and I'm going to buy as many hops as I can buy. And I'm going to take them into Indiana, into southern Indiana, and sell them to the distillers for making yeast. And they'll be so happy to see me. Well, when he got here, what he didn't realize is the region of Germany and the Black Forest in particular that these guys were from, and parts of France and parts of Wales and Ireland, they didn't use hops for yeast. They were milk cultures because they're growing primarily apples. And underneath those apple trees, they're running cattle to eat the apples, so they have access to milk. So they were using lactobacillus to go along with their yeast. And the cool thing about, don't just go buy any lactobacillus. It needs to be one of the yogurt strains.
Well, I think the Greek yogurt's probably one of your better ones for that.
It is. And honestly, Activia works fine. I've used that before. Or you can actually go and buy straight up milk cultures, and those work really well as well. Choose It. CHOOZIT is a really good one. They've got multiple different varieties you can choose from, and a bunch of other cool stuff you can play with too that I played with over the years. But I will inoculate the same wash with that. After I get the yeast going, I'll let the yeast get going. Once it's up to 36 hours, I'll put, a tablespoon of yogurt in there. And what's going to happen is that yeast is going to kick and it's going to run hard. It's going to get through 3/4 of the fermentation. When it gets through 3/4, it's going to start to die back. Well, that's the point at which you start having to worry about bacteria moving in, taking over, and destroying things, right? And lactobacillus has some good flavor to it. It brings some earthiness and some creaminess through and mouthfeel. Mm-hmm. So this particular lactobacillus, it will not start working until that yeast actually starts to drop the pH into the 4s and is almost done. That lacto will wake up. It'll start to come into that fermentation as the fermentation finishes. And then what'll happen is that yeast will go dormant. And then what'll happen is that lacto will drop your pH. Our pHs, you can ask my still hand Tyler Richardson, sometimes our pHs, even on whiskey, when they're finished, are in the 3s. I mean, that's
a mistake I think a lot of people make when they hear us talk about pHs. We talk about the starting pH. And as the fermentation progresses, you're going to have a lot of organic acids build up, and your pH is going to drop. And I think a lot of times they feel they have to maintain that 5.3, so they're dumping baking soda and all kinds of other shit in there. Don't do it. It's natural for your acid levels to drop as it progresses. It's just when you start out with a 1070 and you're at 1050 and you've got a low 3 pH, then you're going to have to deal with it. But as it naturally progresses, just let it do its thing, unless, of course, you have an extreme, situation like that, which is generally a sugar wash or something like that really, really fast and as a result of it. But
And on the traditional Seagram side, you'll actually see them freak out about my pH numbers when I finish, because in their mind, right, because they've only learned this one really dogmatic system. In their mind, they see a pH that's like, say, 3.7 in a finished whiskey, and they're like, oh, you had to have acetic acid. There had to be vinegar all in that. No. Nope. And I got a fruitier whiskey for it, so.
Yeah, that's wrong. Totally. Yeah, that's it. That's funny. But yeah, a lot of people do that. They think that, oh, it's got to be 5.3 the whole way through, and they start feeding it, these things. I teach them just throw some oyster shells in there, and as the acids build up too much, they'll start eating away at the calcium, and it'll help buffer it, and you won't have that problem. It's just and it's a good little trick to use. I've always done, and it's.
We have the opposite problem at Old Homestead, because we've got such hard limestone water there at Patoka, because we're sitting on top of Salem-olytic limestone, and even after mashing in, if we don't adjust, which you can adjust with some citric acid if you want a little lower pH.
Back set probably.
Sometimes, yeah, we're playing around with like 1800s back set where we're actually purposely letting it get infected. But if we don't adjust, our whiskeys, even at a 2.5, sometimes almost 3 pounds per gallon, they will end up being, before fermentation starts, they'll end up being like 6.4, 6.5. Right. So we really, and it also, it's interesting because we don't do anything to filter that water really. So if it rains, the pH goes up that much more. And if it's dry, it starts dropping because it's not washing out of the ground. So
you're using citric acid mostly. I mean, that's pretty low pH. Have you thought, do y'all think use that a little bit too?
Yep. So I use at Spirits of French Lick, I always did citric acid. So we for a long time at Old Homestead, we weren't doing much of anything just because we wanted to see how it would ride, and I never had an issue.
Well, the water is a little bit better than it was.
Yeah, and then we did start using back set, but what we do is a little different. So we're not sour mashing like what the home distillers do, where you're taking, spent wash, going back in on a grain bed plus sugar. And we're not doing what they do in Kentucky, which is,
we'll talk about that too.
Yeah, because in Kentucky, what they'll do is they'll take fresh grain and wash out of the still after it's run while it's still super hot, separate all the solids out of it, and then use the liquid as part of their cooking water for their next batch. And so that gives them, spent yeast cells, etc., fixes their pH. What we do is the earliest reference to something that looks like sour mash is or very early 1800s. Again, in Pennsylvania, that's where a lot of this stuff really comes from. But what they were doing was much more like a rum dunder pit or a muck pit. So they're taking the spent wash and grain, they're setting it aside, they're letting it cool, and they're purposely letting it get infected by positive bacteria. And because the pH is low on it, it's really mostly only positive beneficial bacteria that you can get some nasty stuff, but
that's
mostly it's only
negative stuff you don't have.
Right. So we do that. And then what we do is when we do a cook, we'll do a little bit of that on the top side, usually 3 to 5 buckets of it. And then that way it's getting sterilized, right? So we're not getting that bacteria in the actual ferment necessarily, but we are killing the bacteria off, which is giving us the esters that we want. And then once fermentation is finished, we'll pump everything over to the still, and we might do a couple extra buckets in the still in order to up that aromatic content. And it's making some really complex white whiskeys coming off the still. So
okay. Hey, I got a question myself, and one of the questions from the crowd here I want to kind of touch on. Have you ever tried freeze drying the yeast? And what Richards want to know, can you take the foam from the fermentation when it foams up originally? And he wants to know if, I guess you touched on using a dehydrator. Yeah, Richard, just don't go too high in temperature to kill your yeast. 90 degrees, like I was talking about, is plenty. It will take some time, so just be patient with that.
Yeah, so I've not ever done the freeze dried thing at all. I've never, I'm sure that had I leaned more into the science of it for a longer period of time, as opposed to being, like I said earlier, like water finding the easy way out, I might have gone there.
Right.
In terms of collecting the foam, yes. So this is, and again, this is where I don't think linear, and I always forget certain things that are important. So one thing to remember about pooling grain and or foam and or samples for yeast propagation from a mash. So you can actually change, one of the mutations you can cause is by selection alone. So if you want something, say, like that's more like a lager yeast with a long fermentation period where it ferments on the bottom, if you continuously pull grain from the bottom of your fermenter for your yeast, it'll start to trend that direction. If you want something more like a champagne yeast, if you pull from the middle of the fermenter, you'll start to lean that direction. For distilling, the stuff on the top, the cap, that's what you really want. You could pull the foam though and just liquid, and that would work fine as well. So ideally with a Donna jug, I can tell you. What's that?
New. I learned something new. That's very interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting how that's another thing I love, not just about distilling but about agriculture. How you work with a living thing and what is its response to the way you manage it. You know what I mean? It really changes things depending on what you're selecting for. You know.
Yeah. All right. Now talking about the sour mash thing, yeah, you hit on it. There's a lot of people that are fixated on the Uncle Jesse's, super sour mash, recipe where you just take a little back set, mix it with sugar, pour it on the old grain, and by the 5th generation, it's basically a corn flavored sugar shine, and it's not really going to perpetuate well. And what I've been trying to preach is kind of in between the Kentucky method, the original sour mashing method, changing the grain using back set on the new to cook the new grain, and that is taking some of that grain out and replenishing it with maybe 10% each time, and using sugar, kind of a little bit of a combination of the two to help simplify it, but at the same time keep that flavor profile for in perpetuity. So you can just keep going until I guess it's too cold. You have to bring it all inside and just keep it going that way. But a lot of people don't understand that the original sour mashing method, and I'm guessing it's original. I could be wrong on this, and correct me if I'm wrong. Was changing the grains out, recooking, redoing all the grains, but just using the back set, to adjust the pH and to actually do the cooking and so that's
the Kentucky version for sure. That's the way they did it. And like I said, there's that older Pennsylvania one, which is much more. And I'll be honest with you, like I would never recommend that Pennsylvania version for a sugar shine, because you're for sure going to get some weirdness going in there, So, but I did Uncle Jesse's for a long time, and I like what you're recommending, because it gives you a little bit of almost like what Jesse from Skillet talks about with a safety net mash, right? You can get a little conversion, but also have the sugar there as your main source. And when you get that little bit of conversion, it gives you a little bit more of a punch of flavor.
Yeah, and keep that profile, because a lot of people, they get to the 5th, 6th generation, and then they're like, it's just not the same anymore. It's not as good as it used to be. And I think that their grain spent, and it's just not.
It is.
It is. Now, have you experimented much with the Yellow Label Angel yeast that's got its own enzymes basically built in that does a lot of the conversions? And my thoughts is using that in the sour mashing and kind of doing a perpetual sour mash where you can just dump the grain, add new grain, and add back set, and kind of combine that with the old method and using the conversion power of the Yellow Label. Will that continue as long as we keep the percentages of alcohol in our back set low, our temperature when we pour it back in low, and do our best not to kill anything off and denature anything? Is that something that you think would be possible? And it's something I want to experiment with this spring and summer. And it's, kind of a brainstorm. I kind of put two things together. I'm like, well, I just wonder if I can perpetually use it. I know it's going to take a lot longer. It's definitely going to be a slower process.
Yeah.
It's definitely going to be a much slower process than just dumping sugar, in it and letting it do its thing. But I think it'd be pretty interesting and seeing how that works out. Because if you could, I think it'd be a pretty interesting product.
I think you could. I played with Angel for a long time. I got interested in it the same way I did with the Beavers. My buddy Bob in Costa Rica was starting in on it, and Bob's the first one that told me that you could propagate the Angel Yellow. And I was like, yeah, that doesn't seem like
I just wonder how long the enzymatic power will continue and carry over.
Yeah.
Will that be something that you would have to add more enzymes eventually, or do you think that would they be strong enough to continue and carry over and go?
I kept one going in a Donna jug with good enzyme activity for several generations. Now, I never had a whole lot of luck with anything with very hard starch or a pericarp like flint corn or dent corn. It just whatever is there. I mean, if you cook the corn good, it would work it, but it would work it so slow it almost always got infected. But now on things like wheat and oats, never had an issue with that. It would work them just fine. So yeah, I mean, my suspicion is, and the theory I've floated several times in the past is, I suspect that Angel Yellow is probably a genetically modified organism, and I'm not pointing fingers, but China's had some intellectual property issues with theft in the past, and
right.
Many years ago there was an article written about a biofuel yeast that had its own ability to create enzymes.
Right.
And we know there was intellectual theft of that particular yeast. And I kind of wonder if maybe the Angel Yellow isn't that yeast from years ago.
Is there a koji fungus or something used in this process?
So I don't think there's anything other than the yeast in that package. But what I think is that they probably took a gene or some combination of genes from koji or some related organism and dropped it directly into the yeast genome. I think that's probably what's going on, because like I said, it had good enzyme activity even 2 or 3 generations out without adding any more, So
now, Clint,
I'll tell you,
Clint jumped in the lobby there. You want back on, Clint, or are you just jumping in there? I can't hear you. Type it out. I can't hear you, brother. You're gonna have to type it out. I know there's a delay.
Now, I think Bob, don't quote me on this, I think Bob uses, at this point, I think he usually uses angel yeast pretty much exclusively. And I don't know if you've ever talked to Bob down in Costa Rica, but man, I love that dude. He ain't afraid to do, he's in a place where he can't necessarily get the stuff that we get, right? So he does a lot of going to the store and what's in the store that I can ferment, and he spends a lot of time in the cereal aisle is where he spends his time.
Yeah.
And he ain't afraid of it. He's Fruit Loops, the whole thing.
But yeah.
It's
bran
good.
flakes.
It's
I like bran flakes, man. Those work pretty well. All right, hold on. Let me let Clint in here say it. What's going on, brother?
Hey, everybody. I was just going to say, with the Wiley, the yellow
Wiley. Just say Wiley.
Yeah, Wiley. Anyway, the primary thing in that is a koji. Has a special fungus, and there's like 3 or 4 different strains of it, depending on what you want to make: liquor, soy sauce, and several other things. But anyway, that takes and eats its way through, whether it's corn, barley, whatever it might be, and it converts it into simple sugars.
Right.
There's a good chance, and I can't prove it, but I'm thinking they use some type of genetically modified yeast, similar to turbo yeast or turdo, because it tastes like shit. But anyway, they put that fucking turdo yeast in there also, and it just speeds things up. Now with Wiley, yeah, if you go ahead and you mash your corn, your barley, your rye, whatever it is, then yeah, it's going to work a lot faster, because the koji doesn't really have to work hard, and their yeast will take, and it's got an easy job also. But you can take unmashed cracked corn and dump a damn brick of that shit in there, it'll eat that fucking stuff up.
Yep.
When you get done 2 weeks, 3 weeks later, you're looking at a bunch of what looks like toenails where it's just outside the corn.
Yep.
Anyway, that's
Absolutely.
All right. So anyway, where were we? All right, let's talk about esterification.
all out there in left field.
Oh no, I appreciate that.
No, not at all.
We were kind of touching on the Koji thing. Yeah, I think I'm just wondering if I'm getting a lot of echo, Clint.
I don't have anything on but the phone I'm talking.
Yeah, it didn't have to. You jumped on there, man, but I can hear myself talk. Yeah, I guess I might be getting it through your speakers or something.
There might be a possibility of that.
Yeah, maybe turn the volume down a little bit.
All right, I'm gonna try doing that.
All right. So my big question was about it seems to be a little bit better. The actual Koji fungus or whatever, will that carry over? You know, I'm still hearing myself. I hate hearing myself. Just a second. All right. Yeah, that helped. Just a second. You'll be muted in a minute. So whenever you want to say something, just put your finger up and I'll unmute. That way I don't have to hear me, because I hate hearing me. But my question is, Alan, the Koji yeast or the Koji factor or whatever, the genetic factor, do you think that that's going to be something that'll carry over and continue to break down the sugars, or is that something that's going to need to be replenished? I'm just curious. I know that the yeast will survive and carry over, but will that enzymatic power, that comes with the Koji or whatever?
That's kind of what I'm driving at. So, and I know what Clint's saying, that it's supposed to be a two-part thing, a Koji and a yeast, but I can tell you that from the propagation process, that if it were just Koji and yeast, I would have lost that ability after the first generation, because the two are not necessarily compatible in terms of how you propagate them, right? And they're not even the same pHs. My suspicion, like I said, is that it is a yeast. It's 100% a yeast, but it is a completely genetically modified yeast that has that Koji enzyme process added to it, right? Which goes back to the biofuel thing and the yeast that came up missing. So yeah, I did that across. Now I didn't do it in the sour mash, but I did it with yeast propagation across multiple generations, and the enzyme carried along the whole time. Cool. And never had a problem whatsoever. Other than, like I said, I ran into some problems trying to cold ferment corn here and there, which again, that's just me being lazy and seeing how far could I push that here and there. And I probably wasn't being as clean as what I should have been. But with oats and rice and barley and things of that nature, never a problem at all. The enzyme worked completely fine. Bob seems to have the same kind of luck that I had with it. So yeah, I honestly, I think that that's what it is. It's a yeast that has a genetic package that has some amount of that Koji genetics within it, at least a couple cells switched out here and there. And I almost guarantee it came out of that fuel ethanol industry, because for those guys, that would be the complete package. To not have to buy exogenous enzymes and yeast separately. Right. Here it is, throw it in, run, that sort of thing. So, I keep waiting for somebody to show up, the Chinese or somebody. There was a yeast engineered a couple years ago that actually produces THC. Interestingly enough, so I keep waiting to see that pop.
Well, I know the crowd that frequents us will be all ears now. I think you just woke a bunch of them up. They're like, "What? Wait, what?"
They'll call that angel green label is what they'll.
Yeah, green label angel.
So.
Yeah, that's interesting. So wow, I wonder how they got to be able to synthesize that out of what plant matter. I'm curious.
And I don't know what form of THC it was. I just know, I remember reading there was a couple of scientific articles that came out about it, and that's been a while back. That might have been 4 or 5 years ago. They were also doing research on getting yeast to produce electrical charges, which was pretty interesting.
Maybe you can get on Joe Rogan and talk about that, man. It sounds like something he'd love to talk about.
Easy went in, right? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it'd be right down his alley there. They'd love that shit.
Yeah. So,
cool.
But
very interesting. All right. So let's talk about stressing yeast before we start getting into esterification and all that.
Yep.
And because that one will kind of lead into the other when we start talking about how we stress the yeast and then start about esterification and the process of the oils and the organic acids and the alcohol all combining over a long period of time, how these phenols can create large huge molecules that break down and precipitate and create flavonoids and flavanols and all this good stuff, and really give whiskey and wine its flavor, and all from tannins and from the vegetable matter and so let's talk about stressing yeast. That's something that we tend to preach to everybody. We want to keep our yeast happy as possible, and for beginners and intermediates and most of us, we want to stick with that. So don't go off thinking, okay, I'm just going to drive this pH down real low, or I want to run these temps way up, because the stressing that they do, when they talk about stressing, most of the commercial distillers are more in a scientific method. Everything is geared towards reproducing and consistency. And you have to maintain a level of consistency. And to get that consistency, you have to keep all your, all the different elements exact. You want to keep all the different, variables, within a very small range and as close as possible to get that true replication. But they found that slight, and I use the word slight, variations to that can give them some interesting flavors. That doesn't mean drive your pH down into the twos. That doesn't mean take your temperatures into the high 90s. These are slight variances. So when we talk about these things, people, take it to the extremes and they're going to ruin their mash. So it's best not to try this. It's kind of one of these things. Don't try this at home kind of thing until you get to that certain point where you do get that consistency and you just getting kind of bored with the same, and you want to try to tune it, or fine tune it or tweak it, if you will, and they're able to do that with slight temperature changes, during the mashing process. Alan touched on earlier how, higher temperatures tend to create, extra, what we consider, low or heads is ethyl acetates and aldehydes and congeners. And, a lot of times we don't want a lot of those, but it's like making cuts. Sometimes a little bit of those can be taken and utilized, and that's why we talk about a barrel aging, and that's how the esterification kind of ties into this. Is you don't want just hearts when you go into a barrel. You want a little bit of those heads, a little bit of those tails, because those oils and those esters combined, help esterify and create some interesting flavors that you wouldn't have if you just put hearts in a barrel. That would be a totally different product. And getting that exactly right is part of the art and the science of it all.
Straight hearts in a barrel would be boring.
Yeah, it'd be.
Yes. Yeah, you kind of got to know where the limits of professional art and science are before you start doing conceptual art and magic, right? That's kind of the trick to all those things.
Kind of don't do this at home kind of thing.
Yeah,
but it's very interesting and something I want to touch on for those that are a little bit watching, they're a little bit more advanced and
or do it at home, but don't blame me if you get it wrong.
Right. Well,
yeah.
we've got some commercial distillers too that watch the show as well, and it might be something that they want to maybe tweak a little bit.
Yeah, so I do a little bit of stressing of yeast, actually quite a bit now. So sometimes I have done it in the past for stylistic reasons. So I'll give you probably the easiest example that comes to mind would be a yeast like EC1118 or Vin 13 or OK yeast in that family. So I have comments on the YouTube channel where when I recommend EC1118, people are like, oh, it's boring. It doesn't have any flavor. It doesn't have this, that, or the other. Play with the parameters a little bit, especially with temperature with EC1118. If you've got to use EC1118 for something, it's probably because you had a problem to begin with. If, for example, on an apple brandy, you push the temperature a little bit above the recommended rate, like say you're not going to set it 67 degrees, right? And when I say a little bit, I'll push it pretty hard. I might push that up to 80 degrees, and you'd be surprised what you would pull out aroma-wise from EC 1118 with a little bit of stress on it. It might be a lot more dynamic than you think it is.
Right.
Now, at Old Homestead, it gets more interesting because as of yet, I don't have a chiller on my fermenters, and my big fermenters are 500 gallons. So you can imagine in the summertime how warm that's getting, right?
And they're exothermic. They producing their own heat, so it's not just the ambient heat. They're producing their own. So you got a lot to deal with there. Yeah.
A lot. And so part of the response to that is to use a yeast that will take extreme stress. And this goes back to the Kvike, right? I can pitch that mixed Kvike in there, and we're talking about it. Sometimes it's on the verge of its operating range, and Kvike will operate up to 110. Now, that's not going to be a long-term thing for us, obviously.
Right.
But, you know, to get through when you're doing production, to be able to look at a thing and go, all right, so I only have one yeast that's going to do this, and I'm going to stress it. This is on the absolute max side, but what's going to come off is going to be amazing. And there'll come a day when I have a chiller where you know, I wish I was able to do that again, to get back to what I had, or to turn the chiller off to that, because you can create interesting compounds, fruity compounds, pineapple, banana, guava, strawberry. And I don't mean like you read a descriptor and then you taste the thing or you smell the thing and you're like, well, if I close my eyes and think really hard. I mean, obvious aromatic precursors that come across during distillation. Sometimes that'll happen, like I said, with something like EC 1118, trying to push, you know, some of those more interesting things out of those yeasts as well. Or D45. D45 traditionally is more of a mead yeast, but I have used it for, yeah, got the echo going there.
Yeah, I can hear the echo.
Oh,
I got the,
sorry about that. I'll turn it back off.
Okay. Yeah, just do it when you want to talk, and yeah, that's cool. I might should do that too.
so D45. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, buddy.
No, that's all right.
Yeah. D45 traditionally used for mead and doesn't go to a real high alcohol tolerance, and this involves adapting it over time and propagating it, but adapting D45 to grain is really interesting, because then you start to get those earthy, almost malolactic fermentation flavors out of that yeast alone without having to have a co-inoculation of anything.
Right.
So
interesting.
Yeah, you know,
a lot of D47. Is that pretty much?
Or D47. Sorry, yeah, D47.
Yeah, I think that's.
I got the number wrong.
Yeah. I knew what you're talking about.
Yeah,
it's like when a client thought over Rex. Yeah.
So yeah, yeast stressing is you know, there's start small, you know. One of the other ones that I like to do is this kind of falls in line with the same thing. Don't feel like just because a manufacturer recommends a certain yeast for a certain thing that you aren't doing, that yeast won't make a great product for what you're doing. So
I'm kind of guilty of that. You know, I'm glad you're saying this, because, you know, I might have been wrong preaching this, but yeah, I've been telling everybody, you know, bread yeast, you know, has a pretty good temperature tolerance, nowhere near what a Kveki is, but it's, you know, it's got pretty good, you know, temperature.
It'll take it.
Yeah, it's what it's designed for, right? More so than the wine. I wasn't aware that the EC 1118, you know, would you know, I don't know how, what's the tolerance on it? How far have you pushed it to where it just stops?
I've probably had EC 1118 up to 85. I'm almost positive of it at Spirits of French Lick. Right. So what I found in those instances, though, so because both OK and Vin 13, of course, just like EC 1118, they have the competitive factor, the low SO2 factor. When I was doing those co-inoculations at French Lick, what it was mash on day one, was Fleischmann's mash on day two, was often one of those two yeasts, and often at 85 degrees on those in particular. But now I've gone the opposite direction too. So we made a white rum at Spirits of French Lick with what the hell was that yeast? It was a whiskey yeast that we took down to like 58 degrees and fermented out over, I think it was almost a full month.
Have you ever tried any of this stuff?
Which one is that? I can't read it here because I'm on my
Yeah, this
phone.
is the FSI 927 Firm Solutions. You ever get any
Nope.
of their stuff and not tried any Patrick's yeast?
I know a lot of people that do use it. So and the only reason I don't use it is because so many distilleries now in this area use it that, you know, for me, there are obviously there's a character to everyone's distillations, and one of the characters in my distillation is that they're funky, you know, and and you know, so going to something that's a little more commercially viable. Now, let me say this: if I was running a distillery that was running a low rectification column still, like a Kentucky beer still, and I wanted good quality whiskey, and I didn't want to worry about losing yield, because one thing, if I lose a couple gallons of yield off a pot still, ain't no big deal. But you know, a couple gallons, you move to something that's moving, you know, 50 gallons of mash through at a time, you know, in a minute, you start looking at losing barrels.
Yeah, that is.
Yeah. Then I would be all about, you know, now I do still buy, for products where we use them, I do still buy enzymes from Pat, obviously. And I have no issue with enzymes. For a long time, I didn't.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because they have two different enzymes. You know, one's a little darker, then one's a little bit lighter. What's the difference in those two? Because that's what I was going to, if I ever met him, that's the first thing I was going to ask. What's the difference in those two enzymes?
So he carries a few different enzymes. So he's got alpha, he's got beta, and he's got gluco, and I think he's probably got
even the alpha line. There's like
there's two different ones.
Is it concentrated or
it's a concentrate?
Okay.
Yep. It's a concentrate. Okay. So if I have to look at work and see what we're currently using, because right now we are using enzymes on the inefficient side so that we're not breaking down cellulose. That's the big problem with enzymes, is they're great, but people use too much of them. Right. And they break down cellulose, and then you get a lot more heads.
Methanol, right? That's how they make with alcohol, the cellulose, and that's why a lot of people with pectin, pectic enzymes and using pectinase, it kind of breaks down a lot of those cellular walls, and pectin as breaking down the pectin, but a lot of times it's breaking down some of the cell walls and the cellulose as well. And that's why, a lot of your brandies and stuff will naturally have a little bit more heads and methanol than others. And when we say this, it's still not enough methanol to kill you. Let's get this out in the air and over with. That's the number one thing that most people worry about. Is it going to kill me? Look, you're drinking methanol in wine and beer every day. Nothing's been taken out. So when we distill and we throw that first jar away, that's enough and more than enough to take out. Even if you left it in, it might, you might have a worse hangover. You might get a little ill, but it's definitely not going to kill you. And it's not near concentrated enough for them to kill you. You would have to pull heads, put it in a jar, distill heads, pull the heads off the heads, save those, and continue that process until you super concentrate it into a high enough percentage that it'll kill you. Don't ever try that to experiment. They're crazy, but no, don't worry about it. It's a flavor thing when we take that shit off. So
that's where you get rerun heads. You're concentrating them, and when you concentrate those heads, you're going to wind up, given time, you're going to get sick.
Yeah, you get to a certain percentage that it's going to be all methanol, and that's bad. So, all right, let's see. Where were we talking about?
So on the enzyme thing. So a couple things. So on pot still in particular, again, I have no issue with enzymes, and for many years at French Lick, I produced everything without enzymes other than what was there in the barley malt itself.
Right, so you're just using malt.
Yep, and that's all I was doing. And at some point, we'll get back to doing some of that at Old Homestead. We don't do a lot of it because the way our cooker's set up, my agitation is not aggressive enough. Even if you have a good enzyme count in your malt, you're never going to thin out as much as exogenous enzymes do, even if you use them inefficient. But with a pot still, using them inefficient, not only are you not getting that extra methanol, but secondarily, you're not getting the off flavors that come from breaking down that cellulose in the fermentation. They're not as noticeable on a column still as they are on a pot still a lot of times. Now, I have rerun heads many times at Spirits of French Lick, just with, going back into the next stripping run, because with heat cycling, you'll break down methanol over time, and that's not a problem. But the beautiful thing about methanol is, as you're kind of getting at here, Santa, in particular, is that kind of like snake venom, there's an anti-venom. And the reason that, we're not producing enough is because that the anti-venom for methanol is ethyl alcohol. So,
yeah.
But what does happen, and you see this, I'm sure I'll say this and somebody will get mad, and I don't mean it in any mean way, but you ever notice that the vast majority of people you see now, anybody that drinks alcohol, drinks enough of it, they can end up with some liver damage, etc.
Right.
But did you ever notice that the vast majority of people who really have liver damage issues are the people who are beer and wine drinkers, because it builds up in your system and you're not getting enough ethanol over time when you're sitting down drinking 20 beers in a day or whatever, right, to ever push that out of your system. So it builds up and it converts.
I never thought about that. That's true.
Yeah. You don't see guys that are usually drinking spirits unless they're drinking something real nasty. I'm not saying they don't have problems. I'm just saying it's less common. And what happens is that methanol builds up in your system. This is the beauty of having a friend who's a mortician. By the way, don't ever drink with an undertaker, because you will not win. I promise you that. I have experience there. But so it actually converts in your system. Once it hits your liver, it goes from methanol to formaldehyde. That's what your liver converts the methanol into, and that's what actually eats you up. So, but yeah, a lot of distillers have a problem. You'll hear these guys go out and they'll brag and they'll say, "Oh, I don't use any enzymes at all," and that's okay if you want to do it that way.
Yeah, that's fine.
But if you just cut back, I think the recommended rate. So I use the concentrate. I'm pretty sure I'd have to look at work and see. Say on their alpha, I think for 500 gallons, the recommended rate is somewhere around 900 mils or something like that. I'll cut that back to 750, 800, something like that. And I'm still getting plenty of conversion and not having an issue.
Yeah, that's what I've talked to, a lot of our groups and stuff, and people that talk about, using the grains and the malts to do the conversion. I'm like, if you've got the exogenous enzymes, just dial it way back and use some of those to just help those malted grains along, and it'll just be so beneficial if you can do that. And especially following up the glucose at the end. But yeah, it's
what do you prefer?
I'll tell you. Go ahead.
Liquid or powdered enzymes?
I prefer liquid most of the time. Yeah, that's what I'll use.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's what I've been using for the last 20 years.
Yeah.
I'll tell you where I learned my lesson, and you'll laugh at this. There's 2 times I learned my lesson. So the first time was the first time I ever made a bourbon down at, I was working at Copper and Kings, and we laid down 2 barrels of bourbon that my mash bill and everything, me and my dad, and we actually mashed that in and fermented it at Moonshine University and stripped it at Moonshine University, took it back to Copper and Kings and doubled it. And the first time, no exogenous enzymes, but here's what my dumb ass forgot to do. I did not throw, if you're going to not use enzymes, and this is one thing I see a lot of people miss too. If you're going to use malt, you're supposed to throw about 1% of that malt in before you ever start cooking anything for the alpha amylase. And my dumb ass got busy and forgot and didn't throw a handful of malt in. Now, I made cornbread that day, and here's the embarrassing part. So Moonshine University, it's a classroom, and then there's windows, and there's the distillery area. It just so happened to be the day that they were having a rum class, and that classroom was full, and it wasn't just full of like Joe Schmo. These were like people in the industry that work at distilleries and other distillers watching my hillbilly ass have to open this thing up and scoop out the corn 1 shovelful at a time. Just, and I just imagine the guy on the other side teaching class, like, and that's what you don't do. You know what I mean? And then I get sometimes being brave is also being stupid and being hard headed. So at French Lick, I got so comfortable doing no enzymes. But what happened was I was getting malt and my malt percentages were about 22% sometimes on some of these mashes that we were doing. Right. I got so comfortable with what Breeze was providing to me. Well, they were using 6-row distillers malt, which is what distillers malt's supposed to be, or 2-row distillers malt. I'm sorry. No, it was 6-row. That's right. I apologize. 6-row distillers malt. But what happened was they had switched over to using a high protein 2-row, which looked the same as the 6-row. There was visually no difference. The diastatic power on the beta side was phenomenal. On the alpha, non-existent. So I poured that bag in there, buddy, on that 1%, and we started dropping corn in, and it turned into a fucking brick. 550 gallons worth of brick. The agitator stopped and started smoking. And I was so brave, so stupid at the time. I didn't have any enzymes on hand.
Oh man. Now I'll tell you my experience with the powder. And I know not too long ago, Wayne was talking about using 3 pounds of corn per gallon and being that crazy. You know, when I was using the powdered glucose, I almost had to use that much, you know, to get a decent conversion, because that shit's just so, you know, cretaceous, you know, and so temperature sensitive. 155, you know, it once at 150, 55, you know, when you get over that, denatures, under that, inactive, you know, and it was just so hard to use, you know, and I wasn't getting great conversions with it, and I had to increase my percentages, and you know, that's how you
went up to 3 or 4 gallon or pounds per gallon. Then yeah, you're looking at corncrete.
Yeah. Anything over 3, it definitely corncrete. But I was having to do that to get my 107 that I wanted, you know. And it's but now exogenous, the liquid high temp, has just changed the industry. It's the killer for the malt houses. I'm sure they hate that shit because it's definitely affected their business.
Well, here's what's insane. Here's a little piece of history too that I've written about in the past, and Laura from American Whiskey History has as well. So people think that those liquid enzymes are new. They're not. So those were introduced in I want to say the 1870s, 1880s.
Okay.
Over in Illinois.
For some reason, I'm thinking 1930s or something. For some reason.
No, there was a Japanese fellow over in Illinois around the big industrial distillers back in the 1870s, 1880s. He's the one that first started isolating the enzymes out of koji and using liquid enzyme over there. So it's been around for a long time. And what I love about the Wilderness Trail enzyme, so I use the alpha, the high temp alpha, and then I use the glucose, which is great. It's better than beta. So his glucose, the temperature range is awesome because I can go alpha at high temp, and then I can literally go his temperature range where he's most efficient, at least for us with our pHs, because enzymes are pH dependent too.
Right.
We can literally not throw glucose for secondary conversion until we're down to like 90 degrees.
That's what I was going to ask you. I've noticed some call for 140, and that sounds more like a beta gluconase.
Yeah.
And then some of them call for it at 100, 110, and I'm like, that sounds more like a glucoamylase.
And that's a big.
If that's the case, that you know, some of them are actually a beta glucanase, which is not a glucoamylase. It's very similar, but different. It's not as complete, like you were saying. The glucoamylase it debranches almost everything into monosaccharides, whereas the beta will leave some disaccharides and some oligosaccharides in there, whereas the glucose, it just totally debranches everything to mono. Man,
and the real issue too with using malt or using the beta, if you're dealing with a cooker of any size, you're dealing with thermodynamics. And so, you know, depending on where your thermometer is reading in that tank, it might be 145 at the middle, but at the bottom, it might be 160, 170. You really got to know your equipment.
Alan, do you do a lot of rye?
I do a ton of rye, yes.
You usually step mash it, and if you do, you either use like Sub Visco or Subflow TL, or just step mash it.
So I used to do step mash a lot. I used to do step mash / decoction mash because there's a brand that I do blending for and also do consulting for, whose historic books, you know, that's the way they did it. And I used to use term ml. Nowadays, honestly, I don't bother. I take it straight to 170, sometimes even to 190 if I want to, depending on what I want to get out of that grain. I hit it the same way I do every other whiskey. I do the alpha and then I do the glucose on the way down. But I also have learned the reason I get away with that now is because I very purposefully, going back and looking at historical rye whiskey from Pennsylvania in particular, I very purposely set all of my rye mash bills to never go above 1065 specific gravity. Traditionally, rye was very rarely ever mashed in anywhere. I mean, 1065 would have been high for Pennsylvania. It's closer to 1050.
Right.
So
a lot of people don't realize that most commercial distilleries doing the grains, they don't get much beyond 1060, 1065. That's successful, ready to go. 4 days, run it. It's like,
right.
So yeah, that's
like me. I don't like to do a mash that's over about 1060, 1070 because it just takes too damn long.
Mm-hmm. For corn, I'll go 1075. If I'm going corn heavy, like if I'm making a bourbon or American whiskey that's 51+% corn, I don't mind a 1075, especially because with corn you're getting one of two things. You're either doing a yellow corn, which of itself it doesn't have a ton of flavor, or you're doing a specialty corn that like my Elise corn has a ton of amino acids, and so I can pack that many more amino acids in there at 1075 than what I can at 1060. But small grains, rarely will I mean, 1065 is usually kind of where I aim for on any small grains: rye whiskey, oat whiskey, wheat whiskey, malt whiskeys. A lot of times apple brandy, maybe in the 1050 if I can get enough bricks out of it, if it's actual apples. Or sometimes if you're doing an apple mash brandy, you don't even get that. You might be closer to a 1040, 1045, which is historically accurate. And
apple juice is 1040, 1040. That's I buy the 100% natural apple juice. I've squeezed it out, and it's pretty consistently right at 1040.
And you go back in time too. Here's another one that people don't think about. So thinking about specific gravities, go back to the early 1800s and you go look at the tax records for these distilleries, or you go look at their local internal records if you can find them, or even up to industrialization up into the 1870s, like Jack Daniels. You can find those records. You'll see that their mashes, because they're still using the old pot stills most of the time, they're 1040, 1050 at the most, even on corn.
They had to run everything twice, because they couldn't, get a decent proof coming off it, Plus, they weren't getting a good gravity out of their mash, so when they just
plus you had to worry about scorching, so you don't want a real and if you go and a great experiment for home distillers, moonshiners, and small distillers, go back to the Foxfire book and run the recipe they give you in the Foxfire book. It's 1040. That's 1045 if you do it the way they tell you to. Yeah. It's thin.
Gravity mashes.
I never had anything to check it back then, but that's how I got my start Foxfire recipes and stuff.
A lot faster fermentation.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and you don't have all that extra bulk to worry about scorching.
Yeah,
exactly.
So, yeah. Yep.
So. Definitely.
And then
all right, let's talk about. And I was just thinking about it, man, and it slipped my mind what my next topic was going to be, but we can ease into it. So we've talked about the stressing of yeast. Now let's talk about the esterification and aging and what all goes in. A lot of and talking about being able to make those good cuts and exactly where. And I know it's going to be definitely. What distillate dependent, it's going to definitely be, but in the cuts where you can get a lot of those sweet esters out of the heads. Now, when you barrel, how far do you inch up into the low heads, and how far down into the high tails do you get when you barrel age to get that extra character and flavor? That's something we've talked about because it's foreign to moonshiners, because if you're going to drink it as a white dog, you don't want that, right? You want just hearts because that's the cleanest, but when you're going to be barrel aging, it's a little bit different. You kind of want to sneak into the heads a little bit, and it's definitely in the art of the cuts. That's just something you can't teach, you can't talk about and help somebody understand. That's just something that you have to just sit there and do repetitively.
Make your own whiskey and make it yours.
Yeah, and that's what makes it unique, right? So. Kind of lead us into how you do that. I know it's impossible to teach cuts, but is there do you tend to keep just the low heads near the hearts, or is there a specific mid head cut that you'll make that? Because I know a lot of the fruity floral notes will come from your heads, and I don't mean methanol and I'm talking about in your heads. There's some good fruity floral notes that you can pull from that. And and of course you get some of your oils and stuff from your tails as well to kind of combine to create a chemical reaction that we talked about a little bit about earlier. But let's talk about that and your thoughts on barrel aging and pulling flavors from the barrel, because it's not just the barrel that's giving you those flavors and aging. It's a time process that we talked about earlier. I talked about the polyphenols and how they create large molecules, and eventually that molecule gets along, it precipitates off, and when it does, there's lots of flavors that are given off, and the tannins, and there's a lot of other things that you get from the plants that are going to kind of help out as well. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the aging process and how how you as a professional make those cuts for barrel versus just a white dog, because it's a different thing. It's totally different.
It is. So two initial things that come to mind. The first is, so Tyler Richardson, my still hand.
Oh, that's something I want to talk about. I heard you mention when you and your dad went down with the school and you did your first official run. Tyler did his first official run recently, and I want to give you place for that. Has that or is that something that's in the barrels now, and we're waiting?
Is barrel maturing? Yep, awesome, it's barrel maturing.
Well, I want my name on one of those first bottles that come off there. I want to have one of those.
It was good coming off the still, man. I was very impressed. He did a fine job, and also, so just so people know this, because it's important. So,
and for those who don't know, Tyler followed you from French Lick to Old Homestead, right? He worked with you.
No, he didn't work with me at French Lick. He come hang out every once in a while.
I thought he did. No, okay. Well, I knew hung out there. I thought he was working there. Okay. No,
but now he got the job the hard way, man. And my other still hand I had at French Lick, other than my dad and Pedro, as we called him, both Justin and Tyler. Justin was my other still hand at French Lick. Right. They both earned it the hard way. And when I say they earned it the hard way, I mean they came in because they wanted to, and they volunteered for weeks doing stuff around the distillery with no pay. Right. They had that. You got to earn your way in.
That's right.
So Tyler not only made his own whiskey called Whiskey Chambers, but he did it with his own yeast strain that he captured off some pineapple juice at his house on accident, which is really, really cool. So really excited for him. Glad to see him getting to do that. Tyler is working his way towards, we talked about master distiller earlier. Tyler's working his way towards actually earning the title of assistant distiller, then the title of distiller. Our distilling program will respect those titles. Right. There'll never be a master. There'll be a head alchemist. There might be a whiskey wizard or something like that. But Tyler is laying out that, 2 years from start as still hand to get to assistant distiller, and then however long it is from assistant distiller to just distiller, right? He's going to earn that. So the only thing I ever had to tell Tyler, that I ever had to teach Tyler, I mean, I've taught him other little things too, I'm positive. Yeah. The only thing, because he distilled at home for years. So the only real hardcore thing I had to really kind of drive to Tyler when he started was making cuts for a barrel. Because as you said, at home, you're mostly making white spirit, or you might be maturing in a jar or something like that. And so it's hard for a moonshiner to go from, I need to make this as clean as I can, as tight of hearts cut as I can, to need to leave a little funkiness in here. And it took Tyler a minute to get that, but he's got it down where I want it at now. I don't, when he's running the stills, I don't watch him make cuts. I trust him. Yeah. He's the only, other than my dad, he's the only person I've ever had that I haven't had to babysit.
From going from working a commercial distillery and knowing your cuts, and then, or like a craft distillery, doing pot still, making cuts, and then going to just white dog in your backyard, there's a big damn difference in cuts.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's not day, and it goes against everything we've been taught as shiners, as far as making cuts, because that's all we drank was the white dog, and if that's all you're going to drink, you don't want that in there. But but it's different, for barrel aging.
One of the things that really messes with home distillers or people that are used to making white spirit too, is that there are times, occasionally, it depends on the mash bill, and I'll get to how I figure out where I make my cuts here in just a second, but there are times with certain grains, you got to remember that what goes into the barrel is not the same as what comes out. Chemically, they're two different things entirely. It has changed. It has gone through, it's like the difference between a caterpillar and a butterfly, right? Yeah. It has changed. It is no longer the same thing. But sometimes with certain whiskeys and certain mash bills, and I know people are not going to believe this, but it's true. Not all of them. Sometimes the whiskey that you want to go into that barrel is shit coming off of the still.
Absolutely.
Depending on what it is. And a great example, that would be something like buckwheat. Buckwheat off of the still is a white spirit, true buckwheat whiskey. Maybe there's people out there that like it. I ain't one of them. At all in any way, shape, or form. And the cleaner you cut it, the worse it gets. So
being grungy, and then after a couple of years in that wood, that shit comes out tasting pretty damn good.
Right.
If you put White Dog in there like you normally drink at home, when it comes out of the wood, it ain't got no flavor other than damn it tastes like wood.
Yeah. Yep. So when I am looking at a maturation or a resting, I very rarely do I ever use the word aged. I'll say that up front because you can have whiskey that's aged that is terrible, right? But you're either mature. To me, you're either maturing or you're resting. So maturing is actually going for some prolonged amount of time, looking for certain compounds. Resting, it would be something along the lines of what I do with the Sunshines, where like maybe they're going to be in a barrel for a year and a half and it's more of a blend and balance sort of thing. Not really looking for maturation. I'm just looking for balance between raw spirit, which is cut more like white spirit, and cask, where I get a little sugar and a little tannic structure. Or like instead of finishing, I'll say rested, right? So I conceptualize everything from the get-go. If I come up with something, man, I spend a lot of time up here with everything that I do, just laying in bed, conceptualizing at night when I go to sleep, driving to work, conceptualizing. And when I say conceptualizing, I mean everything from ingredients, methodology, yeast, and then what is the story? What's it inspired by? Is there music that goes along with this? I have to have the whole layout in front of me. And that includes what the maturation method is.
Hey,
and
Alex,
so, yeah.
What do you think about, as opposed to experimenting with different mash bills or grain bills, doing a separate corn, a separate rye, a separate barley, separate wheat, and then after the fermentation is done, combining them, recording what percentage you put in, to get an idea of what would make a good grain bill for something you like to taste.
All right.
Yeah.
Let's let Alan go ahead and finish up that, and then when he gets done, we can throw some questions on. Let's, because I know for me, when somebody changes my chain of thought, it's like, oh, I get on a roll and I've got my angle, and then I get some outside in that changes everything up for me. So
I'm sorry about that.
That's all right. All right.
Good. It's a good question though, for sure.
And
so
we definitely want to talk about that.
Yeah. So basically, I'll look at, all right, so what am I going to do? Am I going to do, say, for example, a Sunshine product, or, which is basically our version of moonshine, using various different grains, like I just mentioned, where I'm not going to mature it, but I'm going to barrel rest it, right? I don't want the barrel to transform everything. I want it to just kind of kiss the product for a little while and caress it a little bit, right? If I'm doing that, then I know I'm going to go into it and I'm going to approach that just like I would at home. I'm going to make a clean spirit that's going to be drinkable coming off the still, because I'm not using that barrel to push the profile other than to balance some things out. Right. If I'm looking at something that's going to be, that I think, we can lay out all these theoreticals. The distillery is young enough now that we still don't yet know where profiles will land on average as far as how long they're going to set in a barrel. But if I'm looking at something that I think might be a 2-year product, I'm going to cut that a little differently than I'm going to cut something that might be a 4, a 6, or an 8-year.
Right.
But what I'm generally looking at is the longer that I think it's going to mature in that barrel, and depending on what warehousing I use, in other words, how dynamic is that warehouse? Because is it like the one I currently have there, where however cold it was today, that's how cold it is in the warehouse, and however hot it is in the summer, add 10 degrees to it, that's going to change things too. So what I'm going to look at is, as opposed to a home distiller making white spirit, instead of going through and going, okay, let the condenser get cleaned out first a little bit, what some people might call 4 shots. Then you have your heads, acetaldehyde, ethyl acetate, basically fingernail polish remover smell, And then you have your hearts, and maybe you wait a little while before you even cut there. And then you cut, before you start to smell anything vegetative on your tails. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to look at it, and I'm going to be paying real close attention. First and foremost, first thing I'm going to do is when I start to still up for a spirit run in the morning, I turn it all the way up. When it's about to come over, when I know I'm about to the temperature where I'm about to come over, I'm going to cut it back down about a quarter, maybe more from where I'm at. Maybe even all the way down to only being a quarter way on. I'm going to slow down that distillation curve, and I'm going to watch as those heads come over. I'm going to take that first gallon or two off, cleans out the condenser. I'm going to get rid of that. And then the next thing I'm going to smell is going to be acetaldehyde. And it's going to be that high fingernail polish remover nastiness that you do not want. But what's going to happen on a grain whiskey is you're going to be acetaldehyde, ethyl acetate. And it'll happen that quick. So ethyl acetate still has some of that high note of the acetaldehyde, but it can also have some fruity characteristics to it, particularly with like apple brandy. A lot of times it'll come off as red raspberry on apple brandy. Still don't want that. So ethyl acetate on whiskey. About halfway through that ethyl acetate, it'll start to drop there'll be a nice low note in there that starts to come over that goes earthy, almost dirt, truly, almost dirt. And then what'll happen is you'll have these few little grain notes that start to sort of seep into that ethyl acetate. What I want is sort of that point, if I'm going to go 4 years, where let's say that probably 50-50. So it's still 50% that earthy kind of weirdness, maybe even a little ozone, like after it rains outside, that smell that you get, and some of those muted, duller grain tones. I want that to go into my hearts. So maybe that last quarter piece of that ethyl acetate that's coming off, that's where I'm going to make my hearts cut at. And the reason you're doing that is because you want some of that going into the barrel to esterify over time and to oxidize over time. Right. Because what is going in that barrel, again, is not going to be the same as what comes out. That little bit of ethyl acetate you have in there is the backbone and the structure of that whiskey setting in the barrel that is going to have a net positive effect on everything else that goes into that barrel. Absolutely. And as you guys kind of alluded to, if you do not have that, when you get done, your whiskey will be what a lot of times the industry will call it flabby. There's just no definition to anything that's there in the cask. What'll happen then is I'll get that good cut that I want, and I'll start raising temperature just a little bit more, because I don't mind to run a little bit warmer as long as I've got a good obtention temperature, as long as my temperature is where I want it at on the condenser. I'll raise it up a little bit, run a little harder throughout most of the hearts, get maybe 3/4 of the way through the hearts, and I'll cut my distillation curve back down one more time. Now what I'm doing is I'm watching for those tails, right? And it depends on the way your still's made and what configuration you're running, where your tails are going to fall. But what you're looking for, as opposed to with a white spirit where you don't necessarily want any of those tails in there at all, again, in an aged product, you need some of those tails. Mm-hmm. What I'm looking for is a transition between where I have those grainy, very cereal notes going into just a little bit of that vegetative, almost a lot of times like raw pumpkin, right, sort of notes. And I want just a little bit of that. Just a little bit of that. You know, if you put that in a white spirit, nobody's going to want it. Everybody's going to think you don't. Yeah. But going into a barrel, again, that's going to change things up. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to, at Old Homestead, I don't recycle any heads because distillation protocols are completely different than they were at Spirits of French Lick. So I don't need them. I get rid of all the heads. But I do save all my tails. We always run our tails out. Yeah. I used to always run the tails out at Spirits of French Lick and collect those, put them back into the doubling run, and then I would collect a lot of times a Sweetwater cut below that.
I was going to ask you about that. Do y'all use the Sweetwater for proofing, or you just add that and double? When you double distill.
So I used to use it for proofing on some products at French Lick, and I used to separate it. I've stopped doing that at Old Homestead. Again, I'm like water. I'm finding the easy way out. I collect it with my tails to redistill, because we collect down very, very low at Old Homestead in particular. And I found over the years, Sweetwater to proof works for some things, but it doesn't work for all things equally. And there is a spoilage factor there because it is low alcohol. I've had Sweetwater go to vinegar before, so it's easier just to collect it and redistill it. And
now, when you talk about how going down low, you talking about 10% or 15% or?
So usually we're probably setting about 10% if we've got enough volume to catch it.
Right.
So yeah, that's roughly where we want to be at. I can go down further than that, and at French Lick I've gone down extremely far. Now it's a little harder on the stills I have at Old Homestead because they're jacketed, but they're electric, right? And so you got to balance that. What minuscule little bit of quality do you get for the amount of crazy electrical bill
that's what we
you're going to pay?
And on when you're running gas, just forget about it. If you're playing for propane, forget it. You can't even.
You're done.
There's an economic, difference there. It's just not worth it anymore. We talk about that a lot too. It's just it doesn't make sense to go any further. But yeah,
whenever I was using propane, I never went down below 5%. Now that
technically, since it's an azeotrope, it's hard to get below 5%.
Hard to break
because it's it's bonded with that water. And it's once you get to a certain point, all you get is an equal amount of water and an equal amount of alcohol all the way on out till you just run out of water. So it bonds below a certain rate. That's why the chart kind of ends before it crosses, because at that point it's just. And then you definitely you're just throwing money away when you go beyond that point because you're not going to get any lower.
The other thing that I'll sometimes do too, which is going to be different than a home distiller.
I'm sorry, on a pot still. Now.
Yeah.
Yes.
On the other thing I'll do that's a lot different than a home distiller that people might find interesting too is, depending on the whiskey and what the grain is and what I'm after. So once I cut the tails, most of the time I'm just in tails. But that's not to say that there aren't certain products or certain runs or certain times that I might not be in the tails, still checking it and cut a little bit of that back into hearts. It's more common with certain other products. So agave is a great example. Things that are smoked is a great example because the smoke really likes to carry over in the water that you get in the tails. So we have an agave that we do where we actually roast and smoke some limes. And in order to get some of that smoky, roasty character in there, you actually have to cut the tails and then cut some back into hearts in order to actually get that flavor, which is pretty common in agave spirits, even in mezcal and tequila, to be able to cut back and forth. But I'll do that on single malt whiskeys a lot of times too. And sometimes I'll do it on apple brandies. Every once in a while I'll do it on an apple brandy.
So it's those bond better with the water, than the alcohol. That's why they're more plentiful at the low end than during the run.
And then where you'll see mistakes at is because you can go too far too, on either end. I mean, I've tasted and smelled vegetal barrels at big distilleries before where there's clearly too much tails in there. Big mistake I see with commercial distilleries that make apple brandy is they include too much heads because they hit that red raspberry and the ethyl acetate, and you'll hear it all the time. Oh, all the aroma and flavor of apple brandy is in the heads. Ferment a little better and you'll figure out that that's not the case. You're confusing that red raspberry for the apple, and because of that, and the problem is they're so used to drinking it that they don't register.
Yeah.
It doesn't register at all. So, but that's why there's so few, other than expense, that's why there's so few, in my opinion, really good commercial apple brandies out there. And you also, to be fair, this is another one of those weird things. And I'm all for people being cross-disciplined, learn as many things as you can. There are things like fermentation that you can take from whiskey and apply to some degree to apple brandy. But here's what I'll say. Brandy distillers can make great bourbon distillers. Bourbon distillers typically make piss poor brandy distillers.
Brandy's harder to make cuts. That's something that
Yes.
I just point out. Yeah, brandy's a lot more difficult to make proper cuts in than just a grain of alcohol. Yeah, for sure.
It is, especially phenolic things. I think a Scotch whiskey distiller would do okay with brandies. But bourbon distillers, man, dude, keep bourbon distillers away from brandy production. It just doesn't. It does not translate.
It's different. You know, brandy's definitely much more difficult to make the cuts on, and there's a lot more compounds involved and phenolics involved, like we were talking about. Yeah.
And the other thing where I was mentioning that difference between maturity and age as well is
I know she mentioned oxidation and how important that is. You know, in the chemical processes. You know, I was talking about how the phenols create this molecule that keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger until it precipitates out. But the oxygenation is what helps that precipitate out and create a lot of those flavors over time. And it's just like in a wine bottle, the same thing's happening in a whiskey barrel. Is these chemical processes don't take place overnight. They're not instant like, a lot of things, where you can turn a liquid from, clear to green by adding one little drop of this and, it's doing chemistry. This is a very slow process that that's why a lot of the wines, especially the grape wines, get so much better over time. And so will your whiskey up to a point, because then the barrel becomes the limiting factor there. So I guess that kind of leads into, I guess when you take a bourbon out of a barrel and put it in a bottle, there's still that process going on. So I think a lot of bourbons would be better to get finished in a bottle, as to, you don't want a 20 to 30-year-old barrel whiskey versus something that was made, something that
not
was
an American
years,
whiskey anyway.
Right. Something like, like Scotch, of course, but something like, a 12 or 13-year-old put in a bottle and then drink it 30 years later. It's going to be a different product entirely.
Right. And I think an easy way for people to wrap, this is one that people might be familiar with, an easy way for them to wrap their heads around what a cask should be. So think of a good bourbon, right? That you know the qualities of. It doesn't have to be expensive. I'll give you an example. One of my favorites. It's not expensive. That gets shit on for no reason. It doesn't get shit on, but people don't respect it. But Old Granddad Bottled and Bond. There's not. Listen, for a blue collar bourbon, that's and the price is right. Yeah, it's a blue collar drink.
I'm Elijah Craig, or
Right. But go into a distillery, any of the big Kentucky distilleries, because they almost all run the same protocols, the same yeast, very similar mash bills, very similar aging requirements, maturation requirements. Go taste their White Dog off the still. And one thing that you'll notice with almost every Kentucky bourbon from a big producer is diacetyl, which is buttered popcorn. That's what it tastes like, buttered popcorn. But then go to the bourbon, a well-matured bourbon. It's that is not there in that bourbon at all, in the slightest. It doesn't exist, right? Because that change has happened. But yes, oxidization is a huge, huge impact. People forget this too, and this is something I always try to express to people. And I've always had to express this to distillery owners, because bear in mind that distillery owners very rarely know anything about distilling. Distillery owners get really, really pissy about leaky barrels. Right. And you have to explain to them, like, you do the best you can, but here's the deal. Barrels are phenomenal ingredients and really, really shitty storage devices. And they are living ingredients in that they are constantly breathing. That process of expansion and contraction.
You have to have that.
Yeah. And you will sometimes lose a barrel. That's not your fault. I've seen it happen. What happens is a barrel reacts to barometric pressure. It reacts to heat and cold. The heat and cold pushes and pulls. In the summertime, you're pushing everything deep into the wood. You're pulling everything back out of the wood in the wintertime. That's why we don't do barrel selections and barrel picks in January, and I don't do them in August either, because the barrels all taste like trash. No matter how good they are, they taste like trash at that time of the year.
Their location in the rick house itself, you can taste it. Same came off the same tap, same time, same blend.
Yep.
One can be at the top of the rick house, one can be at the bottom, and they'll have totally different characteristics.
And barometric pressure is really, really interesting. So one of the ways I determine when in the springtime I can start evaluating barrels again, wait for that first warm front to come through, and then wait for the cold front, wait for the storm, watch your barometric pressure, because a barrel will do this really cool trick that a lot of people don't know. The liquid contents of a barrel will react the same way that a pond does in the springtime. A pond flips over. The liquid in that barrel, once you hit a certain amount of barometric pressure, that liquid will physically turn itself in that barrel, and it will build insane amounts of pressure. I've seen barrel heads.
Basically, it's a thermocline.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep. And they'll build enough negative pressure or enough positive pressure sometimes. Sorry. They can build negative too. You'll see a barrel head that gets pulled in, but I've also seen them get popped all the way out, and lose a barrel that way. So that's a pretty dramatic motion that's happening, at that time of the year. So I tell people all the time, man, well, especially distillery owners I've worked for, like they bitch about barrels leaking or whatever. And I'll be like, for God's sakes, don't fucking come up here when the barometric pressure is real high and we got high humidity, because you'll swear that everything in here is leaking. Everything's leaking. So
it's like atmospheric convection, but within the barrel.
Yep. Same idea. And that's also where, so here's where a lot of craft distillers have an issue. When you're a craft distiller, you're dealing with a small group of people, a very small team. And home distillers that go into distilling have this problem a lot of times, because we have as a home distiller myself, we have I can do all these things myself attitude.
Yeah, you can't micromanage everything.
Just because you're a good distiller and you understand theory doesn't necessarily mean that you're great at managing mash fermentation. It also doesn't mean that you're worth a shit at making a blend out of your bulk barrels either.
Right.
Or even picking out what is a truly mature barrel. There's a reason the big distilleries have panels and have tasting panels and have multiple people and training programs. And it took me a long time luckily I have a knack for blending, and I have a really good palate despite the fact that I smoke, which is surprising.
Yeah, my palate's not the best. I'm not the best.
But I there's been times I've struggled, and it gets, here's the other thing. If you don't drink a lot, I'm not going to say that there aren't people, because I have seen people that can do this just by nose alone, and I've gotten better at it over the years. But really, when you're building your blend, because that's what a distillery does. Like, most of the time these aren't going to become single barrels. You're going to take, 30 barrels of one product, and they got to be blended together to hit a profile. Most of the time, even if you got a really good palate, and even if you have a very well trained nose, you're still going to have to drink that whiskey to understand what's happening. And so you can imagine what happens when you pull down 30 fucking barrels. And even if you're only doing 5 a day,
I'll volunteer.
Right? And we're going to really have it going on at Old Homestead, because we're not really making much bourbon. We're making a lot of American whiskeys, and those go in the barrel at proof off the still. So a lot of those barrels are 140 proof.
Plus, 130 plus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. So that might be 2 barrels a day, and we'll get to it over, 2 weeks.
And going in at the barrel at that proof is going to give it different characteristics as
changes.
Going in at 100, 110, right? So
yep. Water is a better.
Touch on that a little bit, and the flavor notes that you can tell the differences in
absolutely. So water is a better solvent on wood than ethanol is. So you get better tannins. Yep, better and quicker extraction, plus of sugar, with lower proof alcohol than you do with high proof alcohol. Now, so then why would I go high proof? And I'll tell you why.
Your caramel down that you get the caramel from the lower proof.
And now at lower proof, the other thing that's happening is you are destabilizing the alcohol a little bit. So oxidization, I won't say it happens faster. It happens differently than it does at a higher proof.
Yeah, and we've talked about that and how it influences the chemical process.
With brandy, traditionally, you always enter the barrel at high proof. You rarely ever going to enter a barrel of brandy at low proof. And the reason for that is because you're going to keep that alcohol more stable and hold on to more of that raw material, more of that raw distillate during the maturation process. You're not going to use the barrel bourbon, and if you can't tell, every time I say the word bourbon, I wince a little bit because I'm so burnt out on that whole thing. But bourbon's whole thing is that it's barrel driven. It's always been a barrel driven spirit. And the truth of the matter is, the reason it was a barrel driven spirit is because bourbon was always a little bit of a crude spirit. Bourbon was not highly refined in any way, shape, or form. And a lot of the people that were making it early on were not well trained. And that's not a knock. That's just the nature of the beast. It's a frontier whiskey, and that's what it is. And that's what it had always been.
I love it.
Right. And there's nothing wrong with that. I so many years of doing it and making all the variations and having to deal with the critics and all that stuff, and then having success and then having to try to keep living up to that all the time. You know what I mean? Just it's a game.
I like that phrase, front whiskey. That's pretty good.
So with bourbon, you're using the barrel to drive. With what I'm trying to do, I don't want the barrel to drive. I want a blend and a balance. And here's the real issue that I have with most bourbon. If you were going to differentiate your mash bills and you're going to say, this is a wheated bourbon, this is a heavy rye bourbon, this is a moderate rye bourbon, this has got oats in it, this has got buckwheat in it, this has got rye, whatever you're doing, right? No matter how old that whiskey gets, I should still be able to taste the positive aspects of those raw materials. And in most bourbons, it's not the case.
Yeah, that's what I think. You're only getting 20 to 40% of the original flavor in a matured bourbon. 60 to 80% of the flavor is barrel driven. And, that's so the 20 to 40% that you can put into that barrel is what makes it different and unique. And, like you were talking about earlier, especially with the yeast, using a different yeast, there's a lot of different things that you can do that will make that bourbon your own. But if you make it, like use the same yeast everybody else, you just got a clone, basically. You clone somebody else's bourbon. So nothing that tells me somebody doesn't know what they're talking about more if they say all yeast is the same. It's like, wow. You just had a whole mouthful, man.
Exactly. These higher proof whiskeys that we're doing, so that lets me bump more like 50% raw spirit and 50% barrel.
Right.
Just like I do with my brandies. It's a very brandy approach, right? And why would I do that when bourbon's as popular as it is? Because everyone's making bourbon, and because it's
starting to lose some popularity too,
It is
overproduced. It's been overproduced for the last 20 years.
Exactly.
And now you're seeing, who was it just recently? Heaven Hill, not Heaven Hill, was it Beam?
Jim Beam shut down.
Shut down one of their plants. It's just everybody's saying it had to do with the tariffs. It's not the tariffs. It's worldwide demand and oversupply.
This was going on before all the tariffs, and then the other part of that too. I don't. If you don't mind, I want to touch on that real quick because I do see a lot, and I see people in the industry. The industry is very political, and so they lean one direction or the other.
Yeah, and it's not the tariffs. I mean, that's like 1 to 2 to 5%. That's nothing compared to what's been happening for the last decade. They overproduced.
You know what else it's also not that gets blamed all the time? It's not THC. So THC is affecting the alcohol market, but if you go and you talk to the store owners, the guys that deal in spirits, they're not seeing it. They see it affecting beer and they see it affecting wine, but not spirits. This all started years ago with the overproduction, as you mentioned, and the reason they all overproduced is because it's too much of a good thing.
Well, you see that chart going up and up and up, and you think we just got to produce more to keep up with that chart. It's just going to continue to rise, and the market taste. The kids these days just don't like bourbon as well as us old guys. They're liking drinks in a can. They like vodka with post flavor. Post flavor is now a thing. To us, that was heresy back in the day. Post flavor, now it's what they want. They want a bottle they can open. It's a mixed drink in a can. It's things taste changing.
Here's an interesting thing for you to think about. I've talked about this many times too. The other thing that happened with the bourbon industry, and I'm going to touch on the youth here in a second too, when it comes to their drinking habits and where I see some things happening. The other thing that happened was they thought that all these foreign markets were going to grow and grow and grow and grow. And where they kind of messed up to start with was, bourbon wasn't real popular through the 70s and the 80s. And in the 80s, Scotch kind of got going with single malts.
Right.
And then they ran out of product. And so bourbon starts coming up and sort of upping their prices. And meanwhile, Scotland's over here going, well, we better regroup and get our shit together. Well, bourbon fucked around for just long enough for Scotch to get back into production. And then what happened is everybody looked at the foreign markets, thought that it was endless, but didn't realize that there was no replacement population anywhere in the world, and people just dying off and not being replaced because you don't have as many kids, and there's a lot of things that have to do with that. So now, who are you going to sell to? Because Japan has no replacement population growth.
Well, and Japan's starting
China,
to create their own bourbons too that are
yep.
top notch. So there's a little bit of the market, affected by that as well.
Yeah, that's the secondary part of it. So no population growth. Japan, China, Russia. The only export markets you had were to grow off of were India and Australia, because Europe doesn't. There's
that's our primary. That's the primary demand.
Right.
Is in Europe.
But again, you don't have the replacement population. So even if there's demand, you don't have that next generation of drinkers coming in. So you got Australia, because the problem is India developed, and when India developed, they had their own distilleries, and they will buy. I have friends that do this in the industry. They will buy 6-month-old bourbon by the tote, bring it over, and bottle it 6 months. They don't care one way, shape, form, or the other when it comes to that, right? So that's a lot of what's happened. Now, what I'm seeing with the younger kids, and here's where craft distillers have a chance to do something. So the younger kids, the other part of this whole not drinking thing was COVID, because everybody lost their mind during COVID, and we all drank way too much. So what you have is people's children or people's little brother and sister that grew up watching mom and dad or watching their older brother and sister drink way too much and make really bad decisions. And just like with every generation, you have a little rebellion. Mm-hmm. And so part of that rebellion is what's going on with them not drinking as much. But what is really interesting, they still drink, and they'll drink hard spirits once they're a certain age. You got to remember too, most young kids, even in earlier generations, they don't start off liking bourbon immediately. Most of them don't, but they kind of grow into it. So the ones that are, let's say, like 24, 25 now, they'll drink. They drink experientially. And what I mean by that is they won't drink as much, but these are the same kids that, were paying $30 and $40 for a small pizza, at an artisan pizza place. Yeah. So if it's something unique, it has a cool story and it's authentic and it has a good flavor, they'll buy it because they don't own anything. They buy experiences. So they're buying the experience of that bottle. And the beautiful thing about them is, this is where they are similar to the previous generation, is that once they have something of yours that they really, really like, they become a loyal customer of your brand, but they don't become a customer of that product. They never buy the same thing twice, which sucks. So you have to hold on to them until they age out. And what I mean by aging out is, when do they start having kids and owning homes? Right. If you can hold on to them until then, you got a brand drinker the rest of their life. But you got to get them, and definitely bourbon ain't hitting with them. That's for sure. That's for sure.
That's all about marketing. So I got one marketing question for you, Alan. As far as new distilleries go, how important is it to do the marketing and do it right?
That's what I was going to touch on earlier, Clint. I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest mistakes.
World, but if you don't have somebody out there pushing it, you're going belly up in no time.
That's why we see so many go belly up. And I'm glad you mentioned that, Clint. I was thinking about it earlier, and I was wanting to touch on that. And when I said micromanaging, I think that's one of the biggest problems that a lot of people have these days. They learn how to make the product, and they can make the best damn corn liquor or liquor, whatever, that's ever been made. And you can put it out there. But if you don't have business expertise, marketing, and that happening for you as well, you can't expect to do that yourself. You're a distiller, not a business major. Some people have the luxury of being a little bit of both, but most, maybe have a little delusions and think they can just do it all and take it all on. And I think those are the ones that we see at the auction house selling their equipment in about 2 or 3 years into it. They realize that, you can make the best product out there, but if you don't have the proper marketing and, everything in line and streamlined, you're going to fail. And if you try to sell bottles, you'll never make it. You gotta start out. I want to sell pallets. I want to sell cases. I can't. I'm not selling a bottle. And marketing, I think, is where a lot of people fall short in micromanaging and not allowing outside expertise to come in and help.
There's a lot.
Marketing. What do you think's the biggest cause of failure in new distilleries?
I'll get that in both these questions here. I can wrap them up together. So, I agree on the bulk, right? You got to be able to sell bulk to some degree, but there are exceptions to that rule, and those exceptions are fairly new exceptions. So, if you got a good tasting room and you're attached to tourism, you'll make more off the tasting room most of the time than you will off bulk product unless you're a certain size, right? But again, that falls into experience, and that's the beauty of what we have at Old Homestead is being there at that lake and all the people that brings through every year, etc. Because you don't have to deal with the margins, selling to the wholesaler.
And you're in a state that would allow you to do that, right?
Right.
Some states don't allow that shit. They're
no, some states suck at all this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So then on production wise, before I go to the marketing side, the other part is, so like you said, you can be the best distiller in the world. And where a lot of these guys also made the mistake on the small side is, and I think you and I talked about this once before, but there was for a long time, all these guys that wanted to get in, they all went to the same place to go learn, which basically taught them business, hooked them up with all the exact same consultants who then gave them all the same mash bills, all the same yeast, recommended all the same architects. And so you ended up with literally clone distilleries. And so you're never going to out Old Forester, right? Old Forester's always going to get the buy before you do, even if your whiskey is somehow miraculously better than them as a clone. You're never going to be able to get your prices down where they are. No one's going to give you $75 for your 2-year-old Old Forester clone when they can get an actual Old Forester that's at a higher maturity, right? For better or worse. That's part of what's happened. The other thing is none of them have any character. So like I said, they all use the same architects. There's 15 distilleries I could take you to that they're the exact same pole barn.
They might as well just sell MGP,
Yes, with the exact same equipment, and a lot of them have the exact same MGP barrels. That's another part of it. So I just had this conversation with my business partners the other day. We had a quarterly meeting, and I told them, I said, because everybody's fine. 2 years in, everybody's sort of starting to congeal, right? They're sort of starting to understand how this works, what they're into, etc. And I said, the thing that you guys all have to realize right now is that you think you own a distillery. You don't own a distillery. You own a marketing company, right? No matter how good I am at what I do, if I cannot tell you a story, if I can't take this physical thing, put it in your hands and tell you a convincing and compelling story, or give you an experience that goes along with it that becomes memorable to you, to where 5 years from now it pops up in conversation where somebody's like, hey, you remember that time we went to that little Indiana distillery and they had all that weird stuff? We had that thing that had whorehound in it, and it sticks out. If I can't do that, and I can't tell you relevant things that you can associate with that product, you're never going to remember that product. And that's true not only of the tasting room and tour experience, but also true of being into the market, right? See, this is where they make a lot of mistakes too. Again, just like not everybody can necessarily be the fermentation person, the distiller, and the blender. You also have to understand, even if I'm good at those three things, I have limitations. So I know, for example, that I am great at conceptualizing. I am great at bulk information. I'm great at process. And I am, in my opinion, I'm a phenomenal damn storyteller. I think I am anyways. I hope I am.
You do a pretty good job.
I like telling stories. The problem is I overshare, and I have no graphic design experience whatsoever, right? So I need somebody that can design labels like my partner, Joe Lee. Right. Or knows people who can do that sort of stuff and make a bottle eye-catching and make it stand out from everything else that's around it in the aisle. The other thing is become an important part of the sales team once you go out on the road, because I'm the producer. People want to talk to the producer. They want to know, what were you doing? Why'd you get all the questions like we talked about tonight, right? But also to tell the stories that sell the bottle. But I also know that I'm not the guy I can't go into a distributor and speak distributor language, right? I gotta have you got to have the guy or girl that has the keys to talk to those distributors, to tell those distributors what you expect, to talk them down from some of the things that they might expect, you know, and then to be able to go out into the markets and be able to go between the liquor store that's owned by, you know, the local Indian family, or the craft bar that has the hipster behind the bar, you know what I mean? And be able to turn on that salesperson charm. I don't have that. Now, they can go in and start the conversation. I can come behind them and give them the stories, and that works well. But you got to know what your limitations are, you know? So, and a lot of these guys don't know what their limitations are.
It's like with Fireball. They started off small, and through marketing campaigns, they hit bars, they hit distributors, they flooded the damn market with advertising, and before you know it, man, they had grown exponentially.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and so here's the next place where I think a lot of people have failed, and what you're seeing a lot of now. So, and I saw this at Spirits of French Lick, and I saw it coming. So there's a point where you get to where you go, okay, you have to fall into certain categories, right? You either have to get quote unquote too big to fail, all right, or you have to stay small enough to stay limber. Because if you're in the middle, you're dead. A lot of the ones that have closed are the ones that are in the middle, or they're small ones that weren't attached to a tourist attraction, or weren't making very good product, or couldn't turn on a dime because they didn't know other things that they could do. I'm scared to death for a great many of my friends that came up at the same time Spirits of French Lick did, because they have specialized in, say, bourbon, or maybe just single malt or something of that nature. They're 9-10 years in now, and they can't turn on a dime anymore, right? They're just kind of stuck. Right. You know, whereas I lucked out, and I've come into a new distillery, and I can sort of do, you know, whatever at this point. They're kind of stuck. And the best analogy is the soccer analogy, right? So you either have really, really big, slow guys, or really, really small, fast guys. And there ain't anything in the middle.
Right. And you've got the creative freedom, you know, to make some unique things. Like, you know, Clint was talking about the Fireball. The reason it did so well is because it's a unique product. It's not like you were talking the same old clone bourbon that everybody's putting out, that everybody's aiming to make, that they think fits the demand. The demand's out there. There's no way that you're going to start out fresh in this business and make it selling bourbon. You know, you've got such, I mean, you can, I'm not gonna say you can't do it, but you've got such an uphill battle to climb, not to mention for 4 to 6 years aging time. What are you going to do? You're not selling anything. You know, you got to have some unique product. And, you know, like some companies, they'll get the MVP in and they'll blend it with their own stuff, and they'll make their own creations from it. And that's okay. You know, there's a lot of companies that built their foundations on bringing in that MVP and just blending and building on it. But creating something different and unique. And I think, you know, with your, you know, Sunflower Shine and some of these other things that you've done, you know, it's a niche. And, you know, you talk about, you know, people coming in and tasting Waterhound liquor, Clint, thank you. You know, it gives them a uniqueness. And in psychology, we call it a retrieval cue. And you have to, you know, stand out in a certain way for it to stick in some minds. And then that later on, they'll do something and it'll remind them of you, you know, and in marketing, that kind of clicks too. So you can use the two together and, you know, and create a niche. And
absolutely. Yeah.
Being given that creative freedom, you know, that a lot of people don't really have, or, you know, don't have that mindset to think outside the box and create something new and unique. I think cripples them. You know, I think they get fixated on bourbon with you know, maybe a white dog, and they get, you know, tunnel vision, and they just can't see outside that. And I think that creates a lot of failures too. You know?
I think so too. And I'm incredibly lucky to get to work with the people that I work with currently. It was a long road to get there. And if there's one thing that, you know, you mentioned is a little late on bourbon, definitely 10, 12 years ago is when it was the latest you wanted to get into the bourbon game. You know what I mean? 8 years ago, really, Spirits of French Lick. But I think about what I had to do to get to a point where I had the freedoms that I have now, but also to be one of the very few people who kind of is enjoying seeing the bourbon bubble bust because I can do these other things.
Right.
But thinking about all the variations that I did on bourbon at Spirits of French Lick, I threw everything at the wall. I was doing stuff that nobody else was even, because I wasn't crippled by the dogma of the industry. You know what I mean? Because I came from
You
home,
had great
home distilling.
owners that would allow you to do these things, and not everybody
Yeah.
does that, right? You were touching
Yeah.
on earlier how a lot of investors, you're owned by investors, and they want a big hand in what happens. That becomes a big problem too, because
Yep.
they get fixated on that same tunnel that I was talking about, and they just can't see the forest for the trees.
Yeah. And you almost, if you're going to be a certain size distillery, a small distillery of a certain size, what has allowed me the levity that I've had is working for people who have another business. They have a winery or they have something else. And the same was true at Spirits of French Lick. But to throw all those alternatives at bourbon and put them out there because no one else at that time was doing it, right? And then, like, I remember when it was, the big deal was get everything to bottled and bond. And why? Because none of the craft distilleries were doing bottled and bond.
Right.
And I started rolling out with everything I did was bottled and bond because there's at least a perception of a guaranteed quality here. And I, play the game to a T and get to the point where, at one point in time, my bourbon was called the best bourbon outside of Kentucky by Fred Minnick. It came in number 6 on his top 100. It was like somebody hit the gas. If I hadn't got all those little things done up to that point, I wouldn't have. But the people I work with now wouldn't have felt nearly as comfortable as being like, okay, this guy knows what he's doing. You know what I mean? Let's let him do what he's doing, and he kind of understands how this is headed and where the market is. But you got to be able to look at what markets are served well and what markets are well served, right? And I think that's our niche.
Since the bourbon market has pretty much run its course, other than a lot of the big guys and a few handcrafted places that make good money, can you make money making just neutral grain spirit and selling it to larger distilleries?
Not neutral.
There's a lot of people that just make it, a whiskey, just a white dog. And when we talk about MGP, multi-grain product, that's what, there's a lot of companies that built on that. So, and there's a lot of distilleries that depend on that. That's that they don't even market their own liquor. They just make it and they sell it to, and how many, they've bought some big distilleries lately too, haven't they? Are they out of Indiana or Illinois or?
Well, they're the main distilleries here in Indiana. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a twofold question, but so GNS, no, because there's so many ethanol producers. GNS is, you can buy GNS for $1.50 a gallon, basically.
Don't know, that's grain neutral spirit.
Yeah, so there's really, for a small producer, there's nothing there. Now, when it comes to like MGP and contract distilling in general, so this is interesting too. So growth is pretty stagnant, and I'll just stick with bourbon for an example. So I'll give you guys a little inside baseball on pricing. So 3 years ago, if I had a barrel of 4 or 5, maybe 6-year-old bourbon to the right seller, I could sell that bourbon for $2,500 a barrel wholesale. Right? They take it, they bottle it, they do what they want. And that was true for MGP too, because things got so tight with all the big bottling houses and all that stuff. Right now, from an average broker, I can buy that same exact barrel of bourbon for $1,500, which is only about $600 more than what MGP has in production in the first place. Also, though, I know a gentleman who bought a massive distillery that went under and has no interest in actually turning it into a tourist attraction, having a tasting room, going into distribution. He exports spirits and sells bulk spirit. He bought a couple of other bankruptcy related things And in one foul swoop, I'll say this about his first purchase. He went from 0 barrels of bourbon to overnight having 29,000 barrels of bourbon, that plus a huge property. And I won't describe the property because it would give away what distillery it was. But he bought it. He bought it for tax liability. And before he ever signed the paperwork, he had enough barrels sold to be able to pay for it. All I did was transfer paper. And from that particular gentleman, I can buy barrels for about half that price I told you a while ago at anywhere from 5 to 8 years old. So
you get
that's
that
how
700 or 800 a barrel.
Yep.
That's
but what are you going to do with it?
That equates to a barrel is what? How many bottles? About 100.
About 200. About 200.
200 bottles. Okay.
Yep.
That's pretty good.
So if someone had gotten on that, say, let's call it 6 months ago, because the easy rides are all over. You guys are about to see some real shit go down in the bourbon market. And if you pay attention to Walmart, you'll see it happen already. So the same distributor in many states now is dealing with both Brown-Forman and Buffalo Trace / Sazerac. And you watch your Walmart and watch these guys fight over that shelf space with their distributor, because it's hilarious. And it's going to get real super tight because somebody has got to be the Coca-Cola of bourbon when this all falls apart. And it's going to be one of those two companies.
And actually distributing than there is in making the liquor.
Oh yeah. Yeah. If somebody had the money, say 6 months ago, to buy a bunch of those barrels that I just mentioned, where the easy money was, and it might still be there if somebody had the marketing dollars to pour into it, is to buy a shit ton of them.
Pun intended.
As cheap as you can get them. As cheap as you can get them. Go to a distributor and say, listen, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take all this 5 to 8 year old bourbon that I bought for, pennies on the dollar for what it was a couple years ago. I'm going to blend it to fit my profile. I'm going to bottle the hell out of it. And on my end, I want $25. Okay. You can add your points to it, whatever you want. Still going to be cheaper than the vast majority of premium craft bourbons out there on the market. And you could have sold the hell out of it and been king of the world real quick. But now it's questionable whether you're ever going to pull that off or not. But there was a time period there, about 6 month time period, where somebody with the right mindset and the right money,
the right marketing. I remember there was a music group that tried to do that. And I'm not going to mention any names, Leonard Skinner, but they tried to, they were going to go in and put, have you tried their first iteration of whiskey? Oh, it was horrible. It was horrible.
Bad.
Mark went over there and he was with those guys and he got some of it and then shared some bottles with me and Roger and it was horrible. And I'm like, man, they need me. They need somebody to teach them.
They need somebody to tell them.
Yeah, they need somebody to teach them how to make some whiskey there, man. This is horrible. And then
at least need somebody to tell them that it's bad.
Yeah, and I think somebody finally did, and they changed over, and now they've got a better product. And I'm glad they did because they're great guys. But man, it was so bad. Even their marketing not going to work for them. But you can take like what you're saying. And it's all boils right back to what I was saying. Marketing. You can take that average, decent product. Put a marketing, change it like you're talking with a blend to make it unique, and then make a big mass marketing, scheme, and get people to buy the shit out of it. And you can convince people that it's the best shit ever was, and they have to have it, and they will. They'll pay top dollar for it. It's the same shit that it is in an Evan Williams bottle, and they won't even know it, and they'll pay for it, and they'll brag about it. They'll share it with their friends, and everybody will have to have it. And it's all in marketing.
The other, and it's kind of my last thought on marketing, but the other thing that I think, I know myself pretty well, and I kind of know what my niche is. So this isn't true of everyone, but for me, so the marketing for someone like me that does what I do, it has to be authentic. You know what I mean? It can't just be a made up story. Like, And this is why I do so much of what I do, because what you see is what you get.
And
You know
it's
what I
unique.
mean?
It's unique.
Yeah. I don't try to be, I just try to be the dumbass Hoosier I grew up as. I think people are either entertained by it or intrigued by it in some way, shape, or form. And that has some value to it. I don't ever try to be those things that I'm not. And a lot of brands are guilty of doing that.
Right.
A lot, um, and more power to them, because a lot of them have a lot more money than I do. There's a cat in here somewhere up high about to knock some shit off.
I see some shadows moving around there. So
I heard him. So
now, one thing I want to also touch on is we get a lot of questions about stripping runs, and
oh yeah,
a lot of people tend to not understand the basis and the need for stripping versus first run, and the difference in distillation processes and different types of stills and different distillates itself. So let's talk a little bit about stripping runs and when you shouldn't do it, how you should do it, and why.
yeah. This is another one of those conceptual things where you kind of got to look at what you're making and what you want out of it. So uh, I do a lot of different things. So Old Homestead set
I
up to
know
be
you're
able to
not a
do.
big stripper, I know that you like pot runs and stuff, and that's flavor runs, but
Yeah.
um,
Well, primarily though, I mean, honestly, the whiskeys almost all the whiskeys and brandies are double pot.
you
So
do.
they're stripping and double. And then
Okay.
that's all I did at Copper and Kings. And that's all I did at Spirits of French Lick. It was always pot, strip and double.
Now, when you do the double run, do you pour it back in the back set and rerun it that way and proof it down with back set, or are you just proofing it down with water and running it again?
Water, just
Water.
water.
Okay.
Yep. So it depends. They all have their own thing. And so one of the things we do at Old Homestead is we might run the same mash bill, but we might, on top of changing out yeast, on top of changing out whether it's stainless fermenter or wooden barrel fermenter, we can either run double pot still, which is a stripping run and a finish run, or we can run, pot double thumper, or we can run pot hybrid column and take the same whiskey and make 3 different expressions out of the white spirit to start with before it ever touches barrel.
Right.
So the reason I love double pot still distillation, double pot still is by far my favorite. If I'm going to make a whiskey or a brandy, that is my favorite version of distillation is double pot still. And the reason is because truly, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Almost all of your traditional spirits were double pot still. There's some triple pot still here and there too. And that has some merit as well, depending on what you're trying to clean up. But as far as flavor retention and concentration, and clarity. This is where people get confused by stripping runs. And clarity, double pot still works the best. So can you pull more flavor from, say, a single pass distillation with a thumper or a single pass distillation with a couple plates or just a single pass with nothing? Yes, but it also gets more muddy. It gets less defined, which may be a good thing depending on what you're doing. Also, depending on what method you use. Say you're doing single pass with just some reflux, or you're a single plate or a double plate. You better be diluting your alcohol with some damn water while you're drinking, because you ain't getting out of bed before noon the next day if you drink a whole lot of that shit. And I love that style of distillation. Like Wayne is one of the best distillers in the world as far as I'm concerned. Wayne does a lot of single pass, single plate, but Wayne drinks beer when he drinks alcohol. Alan doesn't drink beer. Alan drinks spirits. And so one of the worst hangovers I ever had was off of Wayne's alcohol. And I knew better. That wasn't his fault. That was my fault.
As far as flavors go, do you believe in the dial of proof, dial of flavor?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Have you ever heard of dial of proof or dial of flavor? Because with a flux column, you can turn your water all the way off and get
yeah.
You can turn it up to like 140 degree proof, get good flavor. But if you want to bump it up a little bit to 160, you might not get the muddiness, but you'll get a higher proof. Well, do you know what I'm saying?
I know. Yeah, I know exactly what you're saying. And so for general preference for myself for drinking, I actually prefer distilling to a higher proof a lot of times. So I like going to 160, 165, sometimes 170 on average for hearts. And the reason for that is, especially for white spirit, and I'm not drinking it at that proof, obviously, but I can pull floral characteristics that I can't find at lower proofs when I get those 160s, 170s, and make some lighter style whiskeys that I really, really like. So again, it all just comes down to what do you want to do with the product, and the idea with Old Homestead is to be able to do all those things. Now, here's what I see, Santa, and I think maybe you might have been driving at this too. So a lot of people that I see on the home distilling side, they'll it's the old timer argument again, right? The backwoods argument of, well, hell, if you got to run it twice, you just don't know what you're doing. First time, yeah. Right? Should have got. I only ever run it through there once because that's all it needs. Well, here's the deal. And when they say run it through once, they don't mean with plates. They don't mean with reflux. You and I both know what they're saying.
Right.
They're both saying run it through a straight up pot still, pull one run off of it. Listen, guys, you can do that. You can do that. And there's a section of alcohol that you can get that is potable alcohol that has good flavor. Again, you better be diluting that shit with some beer or something, because I like to work the next day myself personally. So here's the thing. Traditionally, there are spirits that are made that way. German schnapps are made that way. Small fruit brandies, that sort of thing. They're not drink on their own. They're a shot or two here and there with some beer. And again, there ain't nothing wrong with that. But take that same method that you're using on that single pass, put that in production on scale. You put that in production on scale, and you're going to see real quick by what comes across on that condenser and on that stripping run, why you don't want to be drinking what is coming off of just that single pass with no reflux, no plate or nothing.
Right.
Because you may have a section that runs from 110 to 90 that might be somewhat palatable. But when I tell you that low wines, no matter how good of a distiller you are trash and taste like shit and smell like shit, you don't believe it because you've only seen it on a small scale. Go to a big pot still distillery and go look and see what's coming off of one of those stills, no matter who the distiller is and how good they are. And you'll see why you don't want to ingest that stuff of its own accord.
Oh yeah.
So that's one of the very few things where I get a little defensive with them with that stuff, because and it's not their fault. They don't know what they don't know. There's exceptions to it. I used to do a lot of one pass stuff at home when I was a kid, but the exception was I also had a line arm that went 3 feet straight up in the air that refluxed like a motherfucker, regardless, one way or the other, and would come off 120 on average for hearts. So, but I know there's people that disagree with me on that. I know that if they were to ever see it on scale, they'd be like, oh man, yeah, maybe I shouldn't.
Well, I think if they were to try it different ways. Now, we asked historically, the triple X, that always meant for how many runs it passed, right? How many times it was run through. So people would not just put 1X, it was run through twice was 2X's. And the old triple X was always considered the best moonshine because it was run 3 times. And that's for a reason.
Yep. And they were also doing progressive hearts cuts. So you're recutting everything every time.
I was going next with this. When you do your stripping runs, do you just strip it all off, or do you still pull off heads?
Nope. No cuts whatsoever on the strip. And the reason for that is because those zero types that we talked about, everything's going to reorder on that doubling run, right? So in other words, you've not created all those zero types yet. So if you make a cut on a strip, what you're actually going to do is you're not just going to remove stuff you don't want. You're going to remove things that you might potentially want.
Yeah, I've been guilty of removing the high heads on the stripping run. There's the really high heads and what methanol would be, the 50 milliliter, whatever. But I've always been guilty of removing the high heads, because there's
nothing wrong
with those to be removed again. But maybe I'm making a mistake.
There's nothing wrong with doing that at all. There's a lot of distillers that's exactly what they do, is they will make a heads cut on the stripping run and then rerun. And then of course you have, when you talk triple distillation, the other thing is, depending on what you're talking about, different places have different methods. So sometimes you'll do a strip. Say certain Irish distillers might do a strip. They might make a slight heads cut on the strip. They go to the doubling still. They'll make a wide heads and tails cut sometimes. Sometimes they'll actually cut the hearts in the two sections. One goes over to the third still, and the first goes back to the first still. So there's literally a million roads to roam.
Right.
You know, and most of them I don't see anything wrong with at all in any way, shape, or form. And again, like I said about the guys that just do the single pass, it's just because they haven't seen it on scale to see, you know, how it works. You could do that on small stills, and you can pull off decent stuff. Don't get me wrong. At all. But yeah, like when you talk the triple X thing, the other thing is talking those progressive cuts. So Mount Vernon's a good example. So George Washington actually had 4 grades of whiskey that he sold. So he had what would have amounted to a single pass. He'd have had double pot still. He'd had triple, and he'd had quadruple. But the triple and quadruple wasn't switching out the cuts. It was just progressively tighter and tighter heads and tails cuts. And then he'd take all of that and recycle, you know, those cuts back into the next run, essentially.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And then that would give you your 4 different grades of whiskey you could get from Mount Vernon at the time. So.
And he also made our first liquor tax. Our first tax was on liquor in America.
Right. Right. Well,
back
a lot of people don't realize he didn't want a distillery. He had to be talked into the distillery by James Anderson. His whole thing about the distillery was that he was afraid to do a distillery because he thought it would become a hangout for, like, you know, lazy people to sit around and drink or whatever. And his farm manager, James Anderson's the one that finally talked him into it, because the other thing people don't realize about Washington was he was broke. I mean, Washington was on the verge of being on his ass at Mount Vernon. He wasn't making money off of anything he was doing agriculturally whatsoever. And he was really only successful in business the last 3 years of his life, which were the 3 years the distillery ran. The distillery is the thing that actually finally made him money. You know, that was the only time that he was really, as a farmer, that was the only part of it that was truly successful. So interesting stuff.
100, 200 years ago, before they knew better than drinking lead, copper, or lead, there was some nasty ass stuff around.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So that's one thing I wanted to touch on. Everybody talks about how the old days and the old moonshine was so much better than it is today. And that's nothing that cracks me up. Now, there was probably some unique things done then, and you know, like we talked about earlier, some very unique stills setups. But I think for the most part, I think the distillation, I mean, there are a lot of new beginners in that, and that's why we want to, you know, try to help them and teach them as much as we can and stuff. But I think just all in all, generally speaking, it's much better today than it's ever been.
I don't know. I'm about 50-50 on it. And here's why I'll say that, because there's, at least on the home distilling side, you're right.
That there is a lot that, there is a lot of mass production that's probably not
yes
the best. Yeah.
Home distilling, though, you're 100% spot on.
I'm thinking of home distilling, moonshining, and small craft. You know, just the smaller guys. I think it's better now. But yeah, the big guys, it's the same as it ever was. Probably.
And that's why you will never see me. I won't say never, because there could always be an exception.
Right.
You'll never ever see me hire somebody at my distilleries that comes from another distillery. Right. But I will hire a home distiller if I got room for them in a heartbeat, because they are not paralyzed by dogma of being in the industry. And the thing is, and I wrote a blog post about this several years ago, but they're doing things that are truly, home distillers do the things that are truly creative and truly interesting and truly can change the game. Right. They do the things that you can create a market around, you know. Because because and also the cool thing about being a home distiller, and you guys know this now. One thing I love, and you again, absolutely right. What I love about being a home distiller now is that there is so much equipment out there, and there's so much shit you can get your hands on that is not scalable to go into an actual distillery.
Right.
And craziness
yeah,
that you can pull off.
with a lot of scale. It's really tough to scale it up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all I want is somebody to build a sock slit extractor that I can set on the side of my still and do sock slit extraction, and no one has done it yet. So,
it is what now?
A sock slit extractor. It's usually you'll see them on like lab stills, but think of a gin basket. But what you're doing is you have a condenser on top, but you're not letting any product out. So you're taking and you're filling this basket with whatever botanicals or flavor that you want. You're putting your alcohol down into the boiler. You're heating it up. It boils. It comes up into this sight glass basket where all your botanicals are at. And then it's basically vapor locked. So you have a little thing that you hit and it lets the vapor loose. So all the alcohol condenses back into that basket, sets in that basket with those botanicals at a high temperature. It fills up, has an overflow. You hit the gravity release, everything falls back into the pot. You run it through cycles. So you can make limoncello, for example, in about 20 minutes as opposed to 6 weeks. Right. So, and have, it's a really
deflator to keep that balance and to keep it knocked down. And see, I preach that, doing that to not just load like a bubble plate, but in your sight glass to put your copper mesh. I've been preaching, how we can use copper mesh to help remove the sulfites and stuff, and use our, stainless steels and use that copper mesh to, get that benefit of the sulfur removal. And talking about using your deflator to make it, dance there and load your mesh as you load a plate. So you're just basically doing the same with botanicals.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And like I said, there's no output. So you're basically making the liqueur, like an herbal liqueur, in the pot itself the whole time. And all you got to do is sweeten it if you want to after it's done. It's a super cool piece of equipment.
Are you stripping alcohol and then using the alcohol with water to do that? So
basically stripping and doubling. So I've got finished alcohol ready to go, and it's a version of infusion, basically. So you don't have a
mash doing that. You've got alcohol pretty much with down to 80 or less, I guess.
Yep, absolutely.
That's okay, cool. Yeah, that's interesting. Something for you guys to try. Proof it down less than 80, right? We don't want to go into that barrel, or that pot high proof. I know you
I'm not going to say I haven't, but yes, I know. Definitely.
That envelope, son. We all have.
Yep. I don't recommend it though.
Yeah, to home distillers, no. To distillers that have equipment like Alan does, it's a lot more. You're able to do it a lot more because you don't have those dangers. You don't have gaskets leaking. You don't have, it's a different setup entirely than our Vevers that have like a gasket around the rim that just can't handle the temperatures and pressures because, once you concentrate that alcohol, it becomes a lot more volatile. A lot of people say, oh, well, it won't catch fire below 80 proof. No, that's not true. At 80 proof, at room temperature, it will catch fire, but 60 proof won't, right? Oh, okay. Increase the temperature of that 60 proof and tell me it won't catch fire.
See what happens.
Yeah, it will. So
flashpoint.
Not understanding that science can create a lot of problems, and we want to preach safety. And so this is one of those, don't try this at home thing. Stay below 80 because on our equipment,
absolutely,
that's our limitation on our equipment.
Absolutely.
I got a quick question for you.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little about column diameter and the speed at which you can take off product, as well as, vapor flow?
Right, vapor velocity. Yeah.
So on a continuous.
Well, basically, he's talking about like on a beaver or our 20-gallon, 30-gallon hobby pots. What should be the max size of columns, that we should use, and that we know the continuous columns and the huge setups that
are
commercial, but for us home distillers and us doing 40 gallons, let's say, or less, you know, is I know you preach 4-inch. I know you like the 4-inch plates versus the 2s or 3s because they're just
Yeah.
that much more effective. And that was my influence on getting a 4 instead of a 3. I looked at a 3 for a long time, and
Mhm.
I listened to your advice. I listened and
Right.
got the 4, you know, to go along with it. So I don't think that's going to be oversized for a 18 and a half, 20-gallon pot. But
No,
they're,
no,
you know, for a 10, you know, it might be too much, you know.
yep. Yep. And again, it is going to depend on what you want to do. But for most home stills, you know, obviously there's a point at which you can go down to, and I'm not talking plates, but I'm just talking about, you know, if you wanted a raised column and you wanted, you know, to force some reflux or have some copper in there or whatever, you know, there's certain things you get away with 1.5, but on almost everything, I recommend 2-inch at
Right.
the very least on everything. With plates and the really control plates, 4s and 3s are both good. I prefer the 4s because of the depth I can get out of them.
Right.
But as any of you guys that have run that sort of stuff know, a lot of times too, say you're stacking 4 plates, and this is true of commercial equipment. It's really hard to get that middle section to balance. You'll get the top to balance and the bottom to the balance, but nothing in the middle a lot of times.
Right.
Sometimes it's the top. I saw Wayne's was playing around with a mixture of 3s and 4s, and that might be something that could be considered, but you got to include a reducer in there, which is going to change the way that things are going to flow too. So 4s in general, and then as far as I'm concerned, output is essential. Watching your output, watching your obtention temperature, whatever you're running, whether it's a column or it's you know, just an open system. Where I see a lot of
when
people.
he says attention temperature, I just want to help the beginners out there. He's talking about the distillate.
Right. The temperature of the distillate. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Where I see a lot of people mess up when it comes to columns. So on single pass, as long as your plates are balanced, and as long as you either compress your heads and get that out of the way, or, I mean, on single pass, there's really no other great way to do it. But compress your heads and get that out of the way. As long as your plates are balanced, you can kind of run wherever you want to at that point, all things being considered. As long as you're not losing balance on those plates, as long as you're not running the distillate crazy hot, like, you know, ideally between 68 and 72 proof is about where you want to, or 72 degrees is about where you want to be at for most
Right.
obtention temperatures.
Right.
You're good. Where I see the mistake
65, 75, you know.
Yep. Because, yeah, it's not always possible to hit between 68 and 72. I don't ever even get that at work. Very rarely. It just, you know, when I luck out sometimes.
I mean, for home distillers, if you can, you know, get that kind of, and that's why I preach too, having that worm and that larger volume of water versus, you know, like Liebig, you know, it's a big difference.
Yep. So where and for any home distillers that are fairly new and they're beginners and if you're already at the point, man, where you're running plates and reflux, you are already far ahead of the curve for most people that are ever going to be in this industry. Where I see where they make mistakes sometimes, and this is once you get real advanced, is when you're going to run plates and you're going to redistill alcohol. Right. So now we're not talking single pass. We're not talking 130. We're not talking 140 proof. We're talking people that want to go to those 160s, those 170s, maybe even up to GNS if they wanted to. Say somebody's making alcohol tinctures, that sort of thing. Where I see people make a mistake is they want to try to run a stream off of that. And on a pot still, because those are zero types, you're never going to do it in hold proof. You're going to have to run that thing at a drip, or it ain't going to stay where it needs to stay at most of the time, no matter what you're running. You're also, and this is probably a little controversial for people who are advanced, when you're getting up to, say, the 170s to the 190s, I'll give you a little tip, and it's not so much a qualitative thing in terms of what it does, but it's a qualitative thing in terms of making you slow down and pay attention. You are better with a shell and tube Lebesgue condenser than you are any other condenser when you're dealing with 170 up to 190, because you have to drip it. You can't run any faster than a drip. Now, running a normal pot and running single pass, I always advocate for a good stream, right? I'm not the drip and slow and cold guy. But when you get those higher proofs, you need to slow down and pay attention because things change like that at high proof. You know, you sit there and be running 190 and be like, oh man, this is
and it just
awesome.
drops off the shelf. Yeah, it goes
Gone.
to nothing.
Yeah. And that's where I see people make bigger mistakes, and those are costly mistakes too, right?
Yeah, you got to get.
So-
Yeah, you definitely. So you are a Liebig on that. Interesting.
Yep.
Or a shotgun.
Yeah. Mostly just a straight up Liebig most of the time. If I'm going now, I don't make 190 at work, but let's say I'm making tincturing alcohol at home or absinthe base at home at 170. Almost always Liebig every time.
Really?
So, yep. Because I know it'll make me slow down. You know, I know that I'm not going to get so full.
Yeah, you can't crank.
Right. Yeah. I know that I'll have to pay more attention to what I'm doing.
I can usually take and run, 25, 30 gallons through, say, like a 13-foot column that's packed with copper. I could run slow to begin with, dry my 4 shots and heads off. Then once it gets to the hearts, turn it up to a good stream. But I could fill a 5-gallon bucket up every hour. And
that makes sense.
You gain 170, 180, 190, whatever proof I set it at, even 140. And it'll maintain that until I hit tails. And but now tails hit, that shit is like a fucking door slam.
Yeah, I think what you're doing is you're compressing everything. You're compressing everything with all that reflux, and then once you run out of alcohol, it drops off the shelf.
It just drops.
Compressed everything, and then after that, it just becomes mostly water.
Yeah.
So it just drops off the shelf. You've compressed the heads and the tails into into that run, and then once it all comes off at about that proof, boom, it's just going to be water. I've seen that happen on mine when I was running higher proof. So
yeah, a lot of times what I do whenever I first start tasting tails, and I might notice that it drops by 3 or 4 percentages, I'll pull it in, put it into full reflux, let it set 15 minutes, and then whenever I go to pull it, start drawing product again, that shit'll be back to 190 or 195 for about 5-10 minutes, and then it's all over.
Yep. Keep bumping back up. Yeah, that's pretty common in commercial distilleries. Get down close to your tails, bump back up, and sometimes you have to do that too. You guys know this, but sometimes you have to do that too when you're just doing straight up single pass. A lot of times columns aren't designed well enough or reflux isn't set well enough with the needle valve that you'll start losing balance on those plates, especially as you start coming down in proof. And if you're out of heat to add, the only thing that you can do is start to add more reflux to make up for it. There's that balance between the input and then the cooling. Like at Spirits of French Lick, if I was running the hybrid still there, most of the time it was literally me running back and forth between the valve on the reflux and the actual control box, because you couldn't set that one. It would never set the way it was supposed to. It wouldn't balance right. So
that's why a lot of guys, when they are new, they are scared to death of a cooling management type still. They think, it's too damn fiddly, and you got to play with it. Whereas like a vapor management, where you draw the product from below the reflux condenser, they get it into 100% full reflux. They open the gate, it hits the product condenser, and they draw product. And when you get close to tails, it will shut itself off. It won't go far into tails. And the same thing with a liquid management like a Boca, they're drawing straight distillate, reflux distillate, liquid form, and they don't really need a condenser because it's already liquid.
Yep, it's ready to go. You just pull.
That's it. But when they try to do a cooling management, like a lot of flutes or a hybrid, they can't keep up with it.
Yep. And I've got a liquid management system from Dr. Gratis. Well, it can be liquid or vapor management. I can run it either direction, and I love it. The reason I do the Lebeg and the deflag most of the time is because I'm too fucking lazy to to set up the liquid and vapor management. It's there. I look at it and I'm like, no, because everything else is already
It's just so convenient and easy. Yeah, I'm
right.
the deep plate. Yeah, I like using the
Yeah,
deep
this
plate.
one that I built, I mean, hell, if I wanted, I could make it 20 foot tall, but I usually run it about 9 foot. But yeah, I can run it as a CM. I could run it as a VM. And a lot of times I'll go ahead and put my 4 shots in about half my heads. Then I'll crank the heat up, push it on past the point of no return, and just get a hell of a good flow of product. Use a CM. Is that similar
Right.
to what you do with y'all's hybrids?
Basically, so it kind of depends on what product it is. If I'm redistilling, I'll tell you what I do most of the time. And this is this is not for base alcohol. This would be for like more like light whiskey or that sort of thing. Most of the time, I will go ahead and do a stripping run, go over, take the redistilled stuff, and I will legitimately, and I know I lose some alcohol here, but it's fine. I'll go ahead and run in an open mode, and I'll just go ahead and take off heads in the classic way you would on pot still before I load anything. That way I don't have to worry about those heads setting at the very top in any way, shape, or form, or where I want to take liquid off at because I don't have the appropriate setup to do that. So I don't have to worry about that intermixing happening. At home, if I'm running that Dr. Gratis, I have it set up to where I have multiple offtake points. So I can run it like almost like a coffee still, and I can actually select between different plates depending on what I want, or maybe even run 2 different feeds together if I want to run 2 different feeds together. I haven't done that in a long time. So I tell you guys this might be a good closing point because I still got to grab something to eat and go to bed.
Yeah, yeah.
I've talked to you guys all night. Trust me.
Yeah, hey, we're gonna get you back here too. I apologize to all the viewers. You know, I was hoping to get through this and start dealing with some of your individual questions, but you know, it's kind of hard to stop this. You know, it's such good content, and I think it's going to be beneficial for everybody. And hopefully, you'll come back and watch this video and rewatch it and listen to it over and over again because there's so much really good content in here for you guys, and we can answer a lot of the questions that you asked. You know, with maybe Alan coming back and helping out with it, but a lot of the questions that we can go over. And but you know, love to have you back. We can I'm going to go through the podcast and look at some of the questions that may not have been dealt with, and then maybe we can get you back sometime soon, and we can go through those. Because I know a lot of these guys want to talk to you and they want to, you know, pick your brain and also, you know, go over to YouTube, watch his videos and send some of his questions down. He's not able to sit like this. I mean, this is a, you know, very rare occasion because he's so busy. And I know he'd love to be able to do this twice a week like I do, but he just can't. You know, he doesn't have the time. Maybe when he gets older and tired, he can take over for me and start doing this. But we definitely want to get you back here and you know, maybe, you know, deal with some of these questions individually, or you can go to YouTube and he can, you know, he'll make little short videos and address some of your questions. So maybe you can go through the podcast, look at them and maybe address them individually, and you can go watch them over there. Either way, be great.
Man, I'll always be glad to come back on here because this is the kind of stuff that I really enjoy doing. So I do, I love it. I do one piece at a time. There's 3 things I kind of do for me: the almanac, one piece at a time, and if you have ghosts.
Right.
Those are the things that I love. I love helping people get into this.
Yeah, I do too. I love it.
And not just the alcohol thing, but also essential oils and all that kind of stuff too. People need to have these skills. One thing I was going to add here real quick too. So one of the reasons I don't play as much with those systems as what I used to, and one of the reasons I said I'm a lot like water. So I figured out maybe 3 or 4 years ago, before I left Spirits of French Lick, you know, I'd been doing everything there forever and was kind of the face of the company, and there wasn't really anybody else stepping up to do that kind of stuff. And I kind of got to this point where I was like, man, you know, You do this every day, and it's the coolest thing in the world. But you don't have to do it every single Sunday, you know? And it became one of those, maybe when I go home, instead of doing a cereal mash, maybe I'll just stop by the Walmart and get me a bag of sugar and just throw it in a barrel, you know? I started to revert backwards and going, yeah, well, that's fine for home, you know?
Yeah, I tell everybody here too, man, there's nothing wrong with a good old sugar wash every once in a while.
Yeah.
Don't have time to do the grain thing. There's nothing wrong with running a little bit of sugar wash and just getting you something to drink and do.
A sugar wash is a lot like a prepackaged salad. You know, of its own accord, it can be pretty damn boring. But you put a little time and effort into it and juice it up, man, you can make something pretty damn special.
You sure can.
So you just got to take your time and think about it, you know.
Hey, Alan.
Well, it's 11:30, man. We've had you on here forever.
Hey, Alan. I just want to tell you thanks. You are
thanks for having me.
Knowledge, and
thank you.
It means so much to have you come on here. There's a lot of questions we've asked you today that most of our people ask, but now they get to hear it straight from the horse's mouth.
Yeah, just say it. You're just sick of hearing me all the time. That's
yeah. I tune into you every time I can.
I appreciate it.
Very few other distillers I listen to, but if I see that you're on and I'm on your channel.
I appreciate it, brother. That's very flattering, and it's great to have you on here. We want to get you back. I know you love what we're doing here, and I know that you have a passion, and we'd love to have you as often as you'd like to come, because I love helping the beginners. It's kind of a passion for me and Clint both, and we want to keep the hobby going, keep the craft alive, and the future distillers of America are born out here, right? That's where they cut their teeth.
You don't see me often on here, but I'm usually in the comments.
Yeah, Clint handles a lot of the questions and comments, and I'll give the long-winded explanation, and Clint will handle a lot of the questions as quickly as he can, short term, and as quickly as he can on his phone and stuff. So we work really well together. He handles a lot of the volume of questions, a lot of them, repetitive questions, of course. Everybody has the same questions when they come in here fresh. We get a lot of fresh people in here. And, a couple of weeks ago, we got the privilege of hearing that we've spawned a few distilleries.
That's great.
Opened up a distillery. You've been listening to you guys, and we've got a distillery going now, and it's working great. Everything's awesome. And, just nothing makes me happier,
That's awesome. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
That's always my goal when I bring a new employee in somewhere, is I want them to be able to go out and start a distillery when they don't want to work for me no more. You know what I mean? And to have those tools. But I'll tell you what, guys, it's been a pleasure. And down the line, like if you have a lot of questions come in, if you want to pull 5 or 10 of those, and let's do a rapid fire session sometime.
Yeah, we can do that. Sounds good.
Yeah. I like that's why I like doing one piece at a time. I can do that rapid fire stuff. Like send it to me, and let's
5-10 minutes, we're done. Handle a question or two, boom, bang, bang. Yeah, that'll work great, man.
We could throw a few more intermediate to advanced questions at you.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's why I want to have Alan on. That's kind of why I let him just take the reins and go, because we've got some intermediates and advanced in here, and they don't get this that often. So I wanted them to be able to get some value out of it as well. So definitely love having you here, brother. We definitely want to get you back as soon as possible. Anytime you're willing and able, let me know.
Anytime.
You're welcome at our doorstep anytime, brother. We'll have you on every Tuesday and Saturday if you want to.
Yeah, man.
We'll just make you a part of the furniture here, man.
There you go. We'll definitely get together, because I'm glad to do it again anytime. And please keep up what you guys are doing, because it's important. So
I appreciate it, brother. And everybody out there. We had some leave already. I guess people have to work tomorrow. This is a midweek kind of thing. So great having y'all. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you Saturday. Same bat channel, same time, same bat channel, 8 Eastern. Any last words, you guys, before we go?
Everybody try to stay safe. And once again, I want to thank Alan very much. He's made a
Thank
very
you.
special night.
Yep, yep. It's great. Anytime we can get him here, we are. Thank y'all. Tune in Saturday. We'll see you. Till then, peace out. Shine on. Love y'all.
Later, guys.